Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The fog came up from the Atchafalaya Basin like something alive, thick and white and suffocating, turning the elevated stretch of Highway 90 into a bridge suspended between Earth and some other place entirely. Trooper Calvin Broussard had been working this territory for 9 years, and he'd learned to read the swamp's moods the way his grandfather had read the tides in Terrebonne Parish. Tonight, the basin was restless. He could feel it in the weight of the air, in the way the fog pressed against his windshield like hands trying to find their way inside. It was 0247 hours on a Tuesday morning in late September, and Calvin had been on shift since 2200 the previous night. His eyes burned with the particular fatigue that comes from staring into darkness for hours, watching for the red glow of taillights, for the telltale swerve of drunk drivers, for anything out of place in a landscape that was already strange enough in daylight. The radio had been quiet for most of the shift, just the occasional check-in from dispatch and the low murmur of other units working their sectors across St. Martin Parish. Then, at 0251, the call came through. The voice belonged to Celestine Landry, the night dispatcher whose Cajun accent got thicker as the hours wore on and the coffee ran out. Unit 12, this is Central. We have a report of a possible abandoned vehicle in the water off Old Spanish Trail, approximately 2 miles west of the Henderson boat launch. Caller reports seeing what appeared to be a sedan partially submerged. Caller is a fisherman heading out early, refused to leave contact information but insisted we check it out. You copy? Calvin thumbed the transmit button on his steering wheel. Unit 12 copies. I'm about 8 minutes from that location. Any description on the vehicle? There was a pause, the hiss of static that always seemed louder in the dead hours of the morning. Caller said it looked like a dark, colored sedan, possibly a Honda or Toyota. Said it was maybe 20 feet off the road in shallow water. Couldn't tell if anyone was inside. Calvin felt something cold settle in his chest. A vehicle in the water this time of night could mean a lot of things, most of them bad. Medical emergency, drunk driver who'd lost control, someone running from something and misjudging the road's edge, or worse, someone who'd meant to go into the water, who'd made a decision in the darkness that couldn't be undone. Central, Unit 12. I'm en route. Request you contact St. Martin Parish Sheriff's Office and see if Deputy Fontenot is available for backup. Also, notify Louisiana Wildlife and Fisheries we might need a water recovery team. He accelerated, pushing his Crown Victoria up to 70 on the narrow 2-lane that ran parallel to the basin. The fog made everything harder, reducing his world to the tunnel his headlights carved through the white. Spanish moss hung from cypress trees like the hair of drowned women, and every few seconds his lights would catch the reflection of eyes in the darkness, alligators or nutria, or feral hogs watching him pass with the patience of predators who knew the swamp always provided eventually. Old Spanish Trail was barely a road anymore, more of a service route used by fishermen and hunters who knew the backwaters well enough to navigate them in the dark. Calvin turned onto it and immediately felt his tires slip on mud that was always there, always waiting to pull vehicles into the soft earth that surrounded the basin like a moat. He slowed to 30, watching for any sign of the reported vehicle. He found it 3 minutes later, exactly where the caller had described. A dark sedan, looked like a Camry from the body shape, sitting in maybe 4 feet of water, about 15 feet from the road's edge. The vehicle was at an angle, nose down, rear end still partially visible above the waterline. No lights, no activity, no immediate signs of occupants. Calvin pulled over, positioning his patrol car so his headlights illuminated the scene, and called it in. Central, Unit 12, I have visual on the vehicle. Dark sedan, appears to be a Toyota Camry. Louisiana plates, but I can't read them from this distance. Vehicle is partially submerged. I'm going to approach on foot and assess. Celestine's response came back quick, worried. Unit 12, be advised Deputy Fontenot is approximately 15 minutes from your location. Do you want to wait for backup? Calvin looked at the sedan, at the way the water lapped against its windows, at the fog that was getting thicker by the minute. If someone was in that vehicle, injured or trapped, 15 minutes could be the difference between life and death. But there was something about the scene that made his instincts scream, something in the way the car sat in the water, too perfect, too deliberate. Negative, Central. I'm approaching now. Have Fontenot expedite. He grabbed his flashlight, a heavy mag light that doubled as a weapon if needed, and stepped out into air that was thick with moisture and the rich smell of decay that always hung over the basin. The temperature had dropped since he'd started his shift, and his breath misted in the beam of his flashlight as he moved towards the water's edge. The ground was soft, sucking at his boots with each step. He could hear the basin around him, the calls of nightbirds, the splash of something large moving through water nearby, the rustle of wind through cypress branches. The fog distorted sound, made it impossible to judge distance or direction. He could be 20 feet from the road or 100, could be alone or surrounded, and he wouldn't know until something emerged from the white. Calvin reached the water's edge and played his flashlight over the sedan. It was definitely a Camry, maybe 10 years old, dark blue or black, hard to tell in this light. The vehicle had gone in clean, no skid marks on the road, no torn vegetation to suggest it had crashed through the underbrush. It was as if someone had simply driven off the road at a careful speed and let the vehicle roll into the water until it settled. The rear window was above the water line, fogged from the inside. Calvin felt his pulse kick up. That meant someone had been in there recently, breathing, warming the air enough to create condensation. He moved closer, the water reaching his ankles, then his shins, cold and thick with sediment that made each step uncertain. "Louisiana State Police," he called out, his voice swallowed by the fog. "If anyone's in the vehicle, I need you to respond. Make noise, turn on a light, anything to let me know you're there." Nothing, just the sound of water lapping against metal and the distant calls of nightbirds that might have been owls or might have been something else entirely. Calvin waded deeper, the water reaching his knees, his thighs. The beam of his flashlight played across the rear window, trying to see through the condensation. There was something inside, a dark shape in the driver's seat, motionless. He moved to the side, trying to get a better angle, and that's when he saw her. A woman, middle-aged, slumped forward against the steering wheel. Her hands hung at her sides, her hair obscuring her face, and even from outside the vehicle Calvin could see she wasn't moving, wasn't breathing, was beyond any help he could provide. He tried the rear door. Locked. Moved to the front passenger door, also locked. The driver's side was underwater, completely submerged, which meant he'd need to break a window to access the vehicle. He pulled his baton, positioned it against the rear window, and struck once, hard. The safety glass shattered, cascading into the vehicle's interior in a waterfall of fragments. The moment it broke, Calvin smelled it. Not the expected smell of stagnant water or decay, but something else. Something chemical and wrong, like ammonia mixed with copper, and underneath it all, something organic that made his throat close. He reached through the broken window, unlocked the rear door, and pulled it open. Water rushed in immediately, the vehicle settling deeper as the cabin filled. Calvin grabbed the woman's shoulder, trying to turn her face toward him. and felt something give under his hand. Not flesh, not bone, but something else, something that compressed like wet cardboard. He pulled his hand back, his flashlight beam shaking as he pointed it at the woman's face. What he saw made him stumble backward, made him lose his footing in the soft mud of the basin floor, made him understand that whatever was in that vehicle, it wasn't human. Not anymore. Maybe not ever. The face that turned toward him in the beam of his flashlight was wrong in ways his mind struggled to process. The features were there, eyes and nose and mouth, but they were arranged incorrectly, slightly off-center, slightly too large or too small, like a mask made by someone who'd only heard descriptions of human faces but never actually seen one. The skin had a waxy quality, too smooth, too perfect, and when his light hit the eyes, they reflected back at him the way an animal's eyes did, with a green shine that shouldn't exist in human tissue. The mouth opened. Not in the mechanical way of a corpse moved by water current, but deliberately, with purpose. And what came out wasn't breath or water, but a sound. Low and resonant, like a note played on an instrument designed to mimic human vocal cords, but tuned slightly wrong. The sound carried across the water, across the fog, and somewhere in the distance something answered. The same note, the same wrong frequency, coming from deeper in the basin. Calvin scrambled backward, his flashlight beam wild, his hand going to his service weapon. He keyed his radio with shaking fingers. "Central, Unit 12. I need backup immediately. I need wildlife and fisheries. I need the sheriff. I need—" He stopped, trying to find words for what he was seeing, for what he'd just heard. "I need everyone. Now." The thing in the driver's seat was moving now, not with the jerky motions of a reanimated corpse, but with fluid purpose. It was reaching for the door handle, trying to open it from the inside, and Calvin could see through the broken window that its hands were wrong too. Too many fingers, or too few, he couldn't tell in the chaos of his flashlight beam, but definitely wrong. He backed up toward the road, his boots slipping in mud, his breath coming in short gasps. Behind him he heard the sound of a vehicle approaching, saw headlights cutting through the fog. Deputy Eli Fontenot's patrol car pulled up next to Calvin's, and the deputy stepped out with the kind of casual confidence that comes from 20 years of parish work. "Calvin, what we got? Celestine said something about a vehicle in the water and you sounding spooked, which ain't like you at all." Calvin pointed toward the sedan with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. "There's something in that car, Eli. Something that looks human but isn't. It was making sounds, and something in the basin answered it." Fontenot's expression shifted from casual to alert in an instant. He pulled his own flashlight, a spotlight that could illuminate a football field, and played it across the water toward the sedan. The beam caught the vehicle clearly, showing the broken rear window, the open door, the water that had filled the cabin. But the driver's seat was empty. Calvin felt his blood turn to ice. It was there. 30 seconds ago it was there, trying to get out of the car. Fontenot moved closer to the water's edge, his spotlight sweeping left and right, searching. "You sure about what you saw? This fog can play tricks, and Lord knows I've seen some strange things out here when the mist gets thick." "I'm sure," Calvin said, his voice tight. "I touched it, Eli. I felt it. Whatever that was, it wasn't human." They stood there for a long moment, two armed men with flashlights and training and experience, staring at a partially submerged vehicle that now appeared empty. The fog pressed in around them, and the basin was full of sounds that could have been animals or wind or something else entirely. Fontenot keyed his radio. "Central, this is Deputy Fontenot on scene with Trooper Broussard. We have a vehicle in the water but no visible occupants. Request wildlife and fisheries for a water search and recovery team. Also, request crime scene investigation. Something about this doesn't feel right. They waited. Calvin kept his flashlight trained on the sedan, watching for any movement, any sign that the thing he'd seen was still there. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to find a rational explanation for a face that was arranged wrong, and hands that had too many fingers and a voice that sounded like it came from something that had learned to mimic human speech but couldn't quite get it right. "Tell me exactly what you saw," Fontenot said quietly, his eyes never leaving the water. "Start from the beginning." Calvin went through it, every detail. The way the vehicle had been positioned, too perfect, too deliberate. The condensation on the windows suggesting recent occupation. The woman slumped at the wheel. And then the moment when he'd broken the window and seen what was really there, the wrongness of it, the way it had moved and made that sound that still echoed in his head. Fontenot listened without interrupting, and when Calvin finished, the deputy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what this area used to be, back before the highway came through?" Calvin shook his head. This was part of the old Atchafalaya settlement lands. Cajun families lived out here for generations, isolated from the mainland, developing their own ways. There were stories, folklore, really, about things in the basin, things that lived in the deep water, things that could take on shapes that weren't quite right. My grandmother used to tell stories about the rougarou, but not the werewolf kind. Something else. Something that lived in the water and came out at night when the fog was thick. Calvin felt his scalp prickle. "You're saying you believe me. I'm saying I've worked this parish for 20 years and I've seen things I can't explain. Things that don't fit in official reports. And I'm saying that look in your eyes, that's not the look of someone who's confused or mistaken. That's the look of someone who's seen something real and knows it." Before Calvin could respond, they heard it. The sound came from deep in the basin, carrying across the water with that same wrong resonance. The note that wasn't quite human, that suggested vocal cords designed for a different purpose. And then another sound answered it, closer this time, maybe 100 yards into the swamp. Fontenot's hand went to his weapon. "We need to get back to the vehicles, right now." They moved quickly but carefully, backing toward the road without turning away from the water. The fog was getting thicker, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet. Calvin's flashlight beam caught movement in the cypress trees, something large shifting between the trunks, and for just a moment he saw a shape that might have been human, or might have been something else, standing in water up to its waist, watching them with eyes that reflected green in the light. They reached the patrol cars and got inside, Calvin in his Crown Victoria, Fontenot in his parish cruiser. The radios crackled with static, Celestine's voice breaking through. "Unit 12, Deputy Fontenot, be advised, Wildlife and Fisheries is en route. ETA 20 minutes. Crime scene investigation is rolling from Lafayette, ETA 45 minutes. What's your status?" Fontenot took the call. "Central, we're secure in our vehicles. The scene is complicated. We're going to need additional units and possibly Louisiana Department of Wildlife. This is beyond a standard water recovery." Calvin sat in his patrol car, heater running, trying to stop his hands from shaking. He pulled out his phone and took photographs of the scene. The sedan in the water, the fog, the cypress trees pressing in around them. The photos came out poorly, the fog turning everything into an indistinct blur, but he documented it anyway because that's what training taught you to do. Document everything even when nothing makes sense. His radio crackled. "Calvin, you still with me?" Fontenot's voice. "Yeah, I'm here. I'm looking at the vehicle through my spotlight, and I'm seeing something you need to see. Look at the rear license plate." Calvin adjusted his position, trained his own spotlight on the sedan's rear end. The plate was visible above the water line, and even through the fog and water he could make out the numbers. But it was what was above the plate that made his breath catch. There was a sticker, one of those oval ones that people put on their cars to indicate where they've traveled. But this one didn't show a state or country abbreviation. It showed a symbol, 3 wavy lines intersected by a vertical line, hand-drawn in what looked like black marker. Calvin had never seen anything like it. "What is that?" he asked into the radio. "I don't know, but I've seen it before. Maybe 5 years ago, we had a missing person case. Woman named Loretta Duval lived out near Bayou Sorrel. She disappeared one night, left her car running in her driveway, never came back. When we searched her house, we found that symbol drawn on her bathroom mirror in soap. We never figured out what it meant." Calvin felt cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Was she ever found?" "No." Case went cold, she just vanished. They sat in silence, watching the sedan, watching the fog, watching for movement that didn't come. The basin was quiet now, the sounds that had answered each other gone silent, as if whatever had been calling back and forth had finished its conversation and moved on to other business. The wildlife and fisheries team arrived at 0342 hours. 2 officers in a mud boat with floodlights powerful enough to turn night into day. Calvin watched from his patrol car as they maneuvered through the shallow water toward the sedan, their lights cutting through fog that seemed to resist illumination, that seemed to want to keep its secrets. Officer Gerard Thibodeau was leading the team, a wiry man in his 50s who'd spent his entire career in the basin and knew its moods better than most people knew their own families. Calvin and Fontenot met Thibodeau at the water's edge, all 3 of them standing in the circle of light cast by the boat's floods. The sedan sat in the water like a monument to something Calvin couldn't name. Its broken window a dark mouth, its interior flooded and empty. "Trooper Broussard says there was an occupant," Thibodeau said, his Cajun accent thick and measured. "But now there's nothing. You boys sure about what you saw?" Calvin felt anger flash through his exhaustion. "I'm sure. There was something in that driver's seat. Something that moved, that made sounds. I touched it." Thibodeau studied Calvin's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I believe you. I've been working these waters for 30 years, and I've learned that the basin shows you things that don't make it into reports." He turned to his partner, a younger officer named Rustin Arsenault. "Let's check the vehicle. Full documentation. Photographs, measurements, water samples. I want to know everything about this scene." They worked methodically, the 2 wildlife officers wading through the water with equipment that looked too modern for a place this ancient. Calvin watched as they photographed the sedan from every angle, as they measured the depth of the water and the distance from the road, as they collected samples of the sediment around the vehicle's tires. The fog pressed in close, muffling sound, making the scene feel isolated from the rest of the world. Arsenault was examining the broken rear window when he called out, "Gerard, you need to see this." Thibodeau waded over, and Calvin and Fontenot moved closer to the water's edge. Through the glare of the floodlights, Calvin could see Arsenault pointing to something on the window frame, something that caught the light wrong. "There's residue here," Arsenault said, "on the glass and the frame. Something organic, but I've never seen anything like it." Thibodeau pulled out a sample kit, carefully scraping the residue into a collection tube. Even from 20 feet away, Calvin could see that the substance was wrong. It had a translucent quality, like mucus, but it seemed to shift colors in the light, showing hints of green and blue and purple that shouldn't exist in any biological material Calvin had ever encountered. "Bag it and tag it," Thibodeau said quietly. "We'll send it to the state lab, but I'm betting they won't know what to make of it either." They continued their examination, and Calvin's radio crackled. Unit 12. This is Central. Crime scene investigation is 10 minutes out. Also be advised, we ran the plate on that Camry. It comes back to a Loretta Duval, last known address in Bayou Sorrel. That name mean anything to you? Calvin felt his chest tighten. He keyed his radio. Central, Deputy Fontenot mentioned that name. She was reported missing 5 years ago. Case went cold. There was a pause, longer than there should have been. Then Celestine came back, and her voice had changed. Unit 12, that's confirmed. Loretta Duval was reported missing in September 2019. Vehicle was found in her driveway, engine running, driver's door open. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. She just vanished. Case is still technically open but has been inactive for 4 years. Fontenot moved closer to Calvin, keeping his voice low. 5 years ago, Calvin. That woman disappeared 5 years ago, and now her car shows up in the basin with something sitting in the driver's seat. Something that looked like her but wasn't. Calvin's mind was racing. You think whatever I saw was pretending to be Loretta Duval? I think the basin takes things, Fontenot said. People, vehicles, whole lives, and sometimes it gives them back, but not the way they went in. Changed, wrong. The crime scene investigation team arrived in 2 SUVs, 4 technicians in white Tyvek suits who looked absurdly clean against the mud and fog of the basin. The lead investigator was a woman named Evangeline Hebert, who'd worked major crimes in Lafayette before transferring to the state police. She had the kind of sharp eyes that missed nothing, and the kind of reputation that made other investigators nervous. She approached Calvin and Fontenot with a clipboard already in hand. I need statements from both of you, everything you saw, everything you heard, everything you touched. And I need them now, while the memories are fresh. They gave their statements standing by the patrol cars while Hibbard's team processed the scene. Calvin went through it again, every detail, and this time he noticed Hibbard's expression didn't change. She didn't look skeptical or concerned or anything, except focused, like she was cataloging information that would be analyzed later, in a context Calvin couldn't yet see. When he finished, Haber was quiet for a moment, making notes. Then she said, "The residue on the window frame. Officer Thibodeau sent me a photo. Have you ever seen anything like that before?" Calvin shook his head. "Never." "I have," Hebert said quietly. "Twice. Both times at scenes involving missing persons who turned up after extended periods. Both times the victims weren't quite right. Disoriented, confused, with gaps in their memory that couldn't be explained by trauma or drug use." She looked up at Calvin. Both times the cases were closed quickly. Too quickly, like someone wanted them buried. Fontenot stepped closer. Who would want them buried? Hebert's expression was carefully neutral. "I don't know, but I know that when I tried to follow up on those cases I was told to drop it. Told that there were jurisdictional issues, that federal agencies were involved, that it was above my clearance level." She paused. "I'm telling you this because I think you're about to run into the same walls I did, and I want you to be prepared." Calvin felt cold spread through him. "What are we dealing with here?" "I don't know," Hebert said. "But I know it's happened before, and I know that the official explanation never matches what actually occurred. You saw something in that vehicle tonight, Trooper Broussard. Something real. The question is whether anyone will let you investigate it." The processing of the scene took 3 hours. The sedan was photographed from every conceivable angle. The interior was searched and documented, and samples were collected of the water, the sediment, the residue on the window frame. The VIN was recorded, the registration confirmed. Everything was done by the book, every protocol followed, every piece of evidence cataloged and preserved. but Calvin could see that Hebert's team was finding things that didn't fit. The interior of the sedan was completely dry despite being flooded with water. The steering wheel showed no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing to indicate anyone had ever touched it. The seat showed compression marks consistent with someone sitting there, but the pattern was wrong, distributed in a way that didn't match human anatomy. At 0647 hours, with dawn starting to break over the basin and the fog finally beginning to lift, a black SUV pulled up behind the crime scene vehicles. Two men stepped out, both wearing dark suits that looked expensive and out of place in the mud and Spanish moss of the basin. They didn't introduce themselves, didn't show credentials, just walked directly to Hebert and spoke to her in voices too low for Calvin to hear. The conversation lasted maybe 2 minutes. Then Hebert turned away, her face tight with anger, and the two men approached the sedan. They spent 5 minutes examining it, taking their own photographs with phones that looked like they cost more than Calvin made in a month, then returned to their SUV without speaking to anyone else on scene. Calvin moved to intercept them. "Excuse me, I'm the responding officer. Can I ask who you are and what your interest is in this scene?" The taller of the two men, gray-haired and clean-shaven, looked at Calvin with eyes that showed no emotion whatsoever. "You can ask, Trooper, but we're not obligated to answer. This scene is being transferred to federal jurisdiction. You'll receive notification through your chain of command." "Federal jurisdiction for what? An abandoned vehicle?" "For matters that concern national security," the man said flatly. "You did good work here tonight, Trooper Broussard. Your report will be appreciated, but your involvement ends now." They got in their SUV and drove away, leaving Calvin standing in the mud with a dozen questions and no answers. He turned to find Hebert standing behind him, her face a mask of frustration. "That's how it always goes," she said quietly. "You find something that doesn't fit, something that can't be explained, and they show up. No names, no credentials that they'll share, just federal authority and the instruction to stop asking questions. Who are they?" Hebert shook her head. "I don't know. Some kind of task force, maybe. Or an agency that doesn't officially exist. All I know is that when they show up, cases disappear. Evidence gets reclassified. Witnesses get told to keep quiet." Calvin looked at the sedan, at the water still lapping against its doors, at the symbol on the rear bumper that connected this scene to a woman who'd vanished 5 years ago. "I'm not going to keep quiet." "Then be careful," Hebert said. "Because people who push too hard on cases like this have a way of finding their careers ending badly. Transferred to remote posts, passed over for promotion, sometimes worse." She handed him a card with just a phone number, no name. "If you need to talk to someone who understands what you saw tonight, call that number. Don't use your work phone. Don't call from the station, and don't tell anyone you have it." She walked away before Calvin could respond, leaving him standing at the edge of the basin with Fontenot, watching as the crime scene team began packing up their equipment. The sedan would be towed away within the hour, taken to some facility where it would be examined by people Calvin would never meet, people who would file reports he'd never see. Fontenot lit a cigarette, his hands shaking slightly. "What do we do now?" Calvin thought about the thing he'd seen in the driver's seat, about the face that was wrong, and the hands that had too many fingers, and the sound it had made that wasn't human. He thought about Loretta Duval, who'd vanished 5 years ago, and whose car now sat in the basin with something inside it that wore her shape like a costume. "We investigate," Calvin said. "Quietly, off the books. We find out what happened to Loretta Duval, and we find out what that symbol means. And if those federal agents find out..." Calvin looked at his partner, at a man who'd worked the parish for 20 years and had seen things he couldn't explain. "Then we deal with it, but I'm not walking away from this. Not after what I saw. They drove back to the state police barracks in Breaux Bridge as the sun came up over the basin, turning the water gold and making the whole scene look almost peaceful. Calvin filed his report using the most neutral language possible, describing an abandoned vehicle with no visible occupants and evidence of recent use. He didn't mention the thing in the driver's seat, didn't mention the sounds it had made, didn't mention the way its face had been wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. But he kept a copy of the report for himself, printed on paper and hidden in his personal files, and he kept the photographs he'd taken on his phone, backed up to a drive that wasn't connected to any state system, because he knew, with the certainty that comes from seeing something impossible, that this wasn't over. At 13:20 hours, Calvin was awakened by his phone ringing. He'd managed maybe 4 hours of sleep, his dreams full of fog and green reflecting eyes and sounds that weren't quite human. The number was blocked. "Trooper Broussard," he answered, his voice rough with exhaustion. "This is Special Agent Toussaint with the Louisiana Bureau of Investigation." The voice was female, professional, with just a hint of South Louisiana in the vowels. "I need to speak with you about the incident this morning at Old Spanish Trail. Can you meet me at the Café des Amis in Breaux Bridge in 30 minutes? Calvin sat up, his mind clearing. "I already filed my report." "I know, I read it. It's very thorough and very carefully worded, which tells me you saw more than what you wrote down." 30 minutes, Trooper. Come alone." The line went dead before Calvin could respond. He arrived at the cafe 25 minutes later, parking his personal truck in the lot and scanning the area with the kind of automatic caution that comes from years of law enforcement. The cafe was busy with the lunch crowd, locals and tourists mixing in the kind of casual atmosphere that made Breaux Bridge feel like a place where nothing bad ever happened. Special Agent Toussaint was sitting at a corner booth, a woman in her 40s with dark hair pulled back in a professional bun and eyes that assessed Calvin as he approached. She gestured to the seat across from her. "Thank you for coming," she said as Calvin sat down. "I know you've had a long night, so I'll be direct. The scene you processed this morning is connected to a pattern we've been tracking for 6 years. Vehicles appearing in or near water, usually in isolated locations, usually with some kind of occupant that witnesses describe as human but wrong in ways they can't quite articulate." Calvin felt his pulse quicken. "How many incidents?" 17 that we've documented, probably more that went unreported or were classified as something else. The pattern is consistent. Remote location, water involvement, missing person connection, and residue that doesn't match any known biological material. And the federal agents who showed up this morning. Toussaint's expression hardened. They're not federal agents. Or if they are, they're from an agency that doesn't coordinate with state or local law enforcement. They show up at these scenes, they take control, and then the evidence disappears into bureaucratic black holes. We've tried to push back, tried to maintain jurisdiction, but we keep hitting walls. So what can you do? I can investigate quietly. I can build a case file that exists outside official channels. And I can work with officers like you who've seen something they know is real, even if they can't prove it yet. She slid a folder across the table. "This is everything we have on Loretta Duval. Read it. Tell me if anything connects to what you saw this morning." Calvin opened the folder. Inside were crime scene photos from Loretta's house, witness statements from neighbors, and a detailed timeline of her disappearance. He read through it carefully, and one detail jumped out at him. It says here that in the weeks before she disappeared, Loretta reported seeing someone watching her house at night, someone standing in her backyard at the edge of the bayou. She called the sheriff's department 3 times, but when deputies responded, they never found anyone. Toussaint nodded. and look at her description of the figure." Calvin read the witness statement. Loretta had described the figure as man-shaped but wrong in proportions, too tall and too thin, with movements that didn't look natural. She'd said it stood perfectly still for hours, just watching, and that when she turned on her porch light, it didn't run away. It just stood there, staring, until she went back inside. "She saw one of them," Calvin said quietly. "Before she disappeared, she saw whatever it was I found in her car this morning." "That's my theory," Toussaint said. "I think Loretta Duval encountered something in the basin, something that took an interest in her, and I think when she disappeared, she didn't leave voluntarily. She was taken. Taken where?" Toussaint's expression was grim. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. But I know this. Every person connected to these incidents, every witness who's reported seeing these things, they all describe the same area. The deep basin, the parts where the water runs black, and the cypress trees grow so thick that sunlight never reaches the ground. There's something in those waters, Trooper Broussard. Something that's been there longer than we have." Calvin thought about the sounds he'd heard, the calls that had answered each other across the fog. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to keep investigating. Talk to people who knew Loretta Duval. Find out if she mentioned anything in the days before she disappeared, anything that seems strange or out of place. And if you see that symbol again, the one on the rear of her vehicle, I need to know immediately. We think it's some kind of marker, a way for these things to identify vehicles or people they've claimed." She stood up, leaving the folder on the table. "Keep that. Make copies if you need to, but keep the originals hidden. And Trooper, be careful. People who investigate this too openly have a way of disappearing, too." Calvin watched her leave, then looked down at the folder full of information about a woman who'd vanished 5 years ago and whose car had just turned up with something inhuman sitting in the driver's seat. He thought about federal agents who weren't federal agents, about evidence that disappeared into black holes, about sounds in the fog that answered each other with voices that weren't quite right. He finished his coffee and drove to Bayou Sorrel, to the last known address of Loretta Duval. The house was still there, a small cottage on stilts overlooking the water, with a for sale sign that looked like it had been there for years. The yard was overgrown, the porch sagging, but the structure was intact. Calvin knocked on the door of the neighboring house, where, according to the file, a woman named Marguerite Préjean had been one of the last people to see Loretta. Marguerite answered after 3 knocks, a woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and a suspicious expression. "I'm Trooper Broussard with the Louisiana State Police," Calvin said, showing his credentials. "I'm looking into the disappearance of your neighbor, Loretta Duval. I know it's been 5 years, but I'm hoping you might remember something that could help." Marguerite's expression softened slightly. "That poor woman. She knew something was wrong, you know. Kept telling anyone who'd listen that something was watching her from the bayou. Most people thought she was losing her mind, but I believed her. I'd seen things, too, in the years I've lived here." "What kind of things?" Marguerite stepped out onto her porch, looking towards the water. Shapes in the fog, figures that stood too still and moved too wrong. And sounds late at night. Not animal sounds, not human sounds, but something in between. My husband, God rest him, he used to say the basin was alive, that it had moods and intentions. I never believed him until Loretta disappeared." "Did Loretta ever describe what she saw in detail?" "She said it looked like a person from a distance, but when she got closer, she could see it wasn't right. The proportions were off, the movements were wrong, and the face. She said when she saw the face, she knew it wasn't human. Said it was like someone had made a mask based on a description but had never actually seen a real person." Calvin felt his skin crawl. That was exactly what he'd seen in the sedan. "Did she ever mention a symbol, 3 wavy lines intersected by a vertical line. Marguerite's face went pale. She drew that symbol. In the days before she disappeared, she drew it everywhere. On paper, on her windows, on her walls. Said she kept seeing it in her dreams. Said it meant something important, but she couldn't figure out what. Do you know what happened to her drawings? Sheriff's Department took them when they searched the house, but I took photographs before they arrived, because I knew something important was happening and I wanted a record. She disappeared inside and returned with a photo album. Here, I kept copies of everything. The photographs showed Loretta's house, and on every surface, drawn in marker or pencil or chalk, was the symbol. Over and over, obsessively, like someone trying to decode a message they didn't understand. In some of the photos, there were words written next to the symbols. They're watching. They're waiting. They're coming from the water. Calvin photographed Marguerite's photographs with his phone, documenting everything. As he was finishing, Marguerite said quietly, "You saw one of them, didn't you? That's why you're here. That's why you're asking these questions." Calvin met her eyes. "Yes, I saw one." "Then be careful, Trooper, because once they know you've seen them, they'll be watching you too." Calvin spent the next 3 days working his regular patrol shifts while conducting his own investigation during off hours. He drove through the basin at dawn and dusk, the times when the fog was thickest and the boundary between water and land became uncertain. He talked to fishermen and hunters, to people who'd lived along the bayou for generations and knew its secrets better than any law enforcement database ever could. And slowly, a pattern began to emerge. The symbols weren't just connected to Loretta Duval. They'd been appearing throughout St. Martin and Iberville parishes for at least a decade. Drawn on boats, carved into dock pilings, painted on the sides of fishing camps. Most people dismissed them as vandalism or the markings of some local cult, but the few who'd paid attention noticed something disturbing. The symbols always appeared near water, and they always appeared in locations where someone had gone missing. Calvin was compiling his notes at the kitchen table of his trailer in Henderson when his phone rang at 2147 hours. The number belonged to Deputy Fontenot. "Calvin, I need you to meet me at the boat launch on Lake Foss Point. Right now. Don't use the radio. Don't tell dispatch. Just come." The urgency in Fontenot's voice made Calvin grab his keys without asking questions. He made the drive in 20 minutes, pushing his truck faster than he should on the narrow parish roads. The boat launch was deserted when he arrived. Just Fontenot's cruiser sitting in the gravel parking area with its lights off. Fontenot was standing at the water's edge, his flashlight pointed at something Calvin couldn't yet see. As Calvin approached, the deputy turned, and even in the darkness, Calvin could see the tension in his face. "I found another one," Fontenot said quietly. "Same setup as 3 nights ago. Vehicle in the water, occupant inside, completely wrong." Calvin felt his chest tighten. "Did you approach it?" "Not yet. I was checking the access roads for the regular patrol when I saw the vehicle. Sedan, partially submerged, same position as Loretta Duval's car. I called it into dispatch but told them I was waiting for you before approaching. Figured, after what happened last time, we should handle this together." They moved to the water's edge, their flashlights cutting through darkness that seemed thicker here, more resistant to light. The sedan was a Ford Fusion, dark green or black, sitting in maybe 3 feet of water about 10 feet from the shore. The rear window was above the waterline, and Calvin could see the telltale condensation that meant someone or something had been inside recently. "Same symbol on the bumper," Fontenot said, pointing. Calvin could see it even from this distance, the 3 wavy lines intersected by a vertical line, drawn in what looked like white paint marker. Calvin pulled out his phone and called Special Agent Toussaint. She answered on the second ring. "We have another one," Calvin said without preamble. "Lake Foss Point Boat Launch. Same setup. I'm going to approach and document, but I wanted you to know before the federal agents show up and shut everything down." "Record everything," Toussaint said. "Video, photos, audio if you can. And Calvin, be careful. These things are getting bolder. The intervals between appearances are getting shorter." Calvin ended the call and turned to Fontenot. "I'm going in. You stay here with a clear line of sight. If something goes wrong, if I signal, or if that thing comes out of the vehicle, you call for every unit we have." Fontenot nodded, his hand resting on his service weapon. "You sure about this?" "No. But I need to see it again, need to understand what we're dealing with." Calvin waded into the water, his phone in one hand recording video, his flashlight in the other. The water was cold, colder than it should have been for September, and it had that thick quality that came from sediment and organic matter suspended in every drop. His boots sank into soft mud with each step, and he could feel things moving past his legs in the darkness. Fish, maybe, or snakes, or something else. The sedan's windows were fogged, just like before. Calvin circled the vehicle slowly, filming everything, noting the details. Louisiana plates, current registration sticker, no visible damage to the body. The vehicle looked like it had been carefully placed rather than driven in by accident. He reached the driver's side window and wiped away some of the condensation with his sleeve. What he saw inside made his breath catch. There was a man in the driver's seat, middle-aged, wearing what looked like hunting clothes. His hands were on the steering wheel in perfect 10-2 position. His head tilted slightly forward, and his face, even through the fogged glass, was wrong. The features were too symmetrical, too perfect, like a computer-generated image of what a human should look like, but missing some crucial element that made it real. Calvin raised his flashlight, tapping it against the window. "Louisiana State Police, I need you to respond." The head turned, not with the smooth motion of a living person, but in segments, like something operating on gears rather than muscles and tendons. The eyes that looked at Calvin through the glass reflected green in his flashlight beam, and the mouth opened in that same wrong way he'd seen before. Too wide, too mechanical. The sound that came out was different this time. Not the low resonant note he'd heard with Loretta Duval's car, but something higher pitched, almost like words, but in a language that Calvin's ears couldn't quite process. The sounds had rhythm and pattern, like speech, but the phonemes were all wrong, combinations of sounds that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. And then, from across the water, something answered. Calvin spun toward the sound, his flashlight beam cutting across the lake. At first, he saw nothing, just darkness, and the far shore maybe 300 yards away. Then his light caught something standing in the shallows near a stand of cypress trees. A figure, tall and thin, standing perfectly still in water up to its waist. "Calvin, get out of there!" Fontenot's voice carried across the water, tight with fear. "Get out now!" Calvin backed toward the shore, keeping his light on the figure across the lake. It wasn't moving, just standing there with that same impossible stillness he'd seen 3 nights ago. But there was something about its posture, about the way it held itself, that suggested attention. It was watching him, studying him. The thing in the sedan made another sound, and this time Calvin recognized it for what it was. Not random vocalizations, but communication. The thing in the car was talking to the thing in the water, and Calvin was standing between them. He reached the shore and scrambled up the bank, his clothes heavy with water, his phone still recording. Fontenot moved to his side, both of them staring at the figure across the lake. "How many do you think there are?" Fontenot asked quietly. I don't know, but I'm starting to think the vehicles aren't random. I think there's some kind of lure, or a message. The figure across the lake moved, finally. Not walking or swimming, but sinking slowly into the water until only its head was visible. And then that, too, disappeared beneath the surface. Calvin swept his flashlight across the area, but there was no disturbance in the water, no ripples to indicate which direction it had gone. Behind them, they heard the sound of vehicles approaching, multiple engines moving fast. Calvin turned to see 3 state police cruisers and 2 black SUVs pulling into the parking area, their lights cutting through the darkness. The cavalry had arrived, but Calvin wasn't sure whose side they were on. Captain Raymond Guidry stepped out of the lead cruiser, a man in his 50s with the kind of presence that came from 30 years of commanding respect. Behind him, from the black SUVs, emerged the same 2 men in dark suits who'd taken control of the scene at Old Spanish Trail. "Trooper Broussard, Deputy Fontenot," Guidry said, his voice carrying authority and something else. Concern, maybe, or warning. "Step away from the water. This scene is being transferred to federal jurisdiction." Calvin felt anger flash through him. "Captain, with respect, this is the 2nd incident in 3 days. We need to investigate, not hand everything over to agents who won't tell us anything." The taller of the 2 suited men walked past Guidry without acknowledging him. "Trooper Broussard, I'm going to tell you this once. You are interfering in an operation that is classified at levels you don't have access to. You need to leave this scene immediately." "What operation? What are these things we're finding in the vehicles?" The man's expression didn't change. "That's not your concern. What is your concern is that continuing to investigate will result in disciplinary action up to and including termination. Do you understand?" Calvin looked at Guidry, whose face showed frustration and resignation in equal measure. The captain gave a small shake of his head. "A warning. I understand," Calvin said through gritted teeth. "Good. Now both of you, leave. File your reports as witnessing an abandoned vehicle and nothing more. Don't mention occupants, don't mention any unusual features. Standard abandoned vehicle recovery." Calvin and Fontenot got in their vehicles and drove away, but not far. Calvin pulled over at a turnoff a quarter-mile down the road, and Fontenot pulled in behind him. They sat on the tailgate of Calvin's truck, watching the lights from the scene reflecting off the low clouds. "They're covering it up," Fontenot said. "Whatever this is, whoever those people are, they don't want anyone knowing about it." Calvin pulled out his phone and reviewed the video he'd recorded. The footage was shaky but clear enough. The figure in the sedan, the thing across the lake, the symbols on the bumper. He'd documented everything before the scene was taken from him. "I'm going to find out what happened to these people," Calvin said. "Loretta Duval and whoever was in that Ford tonight. I'm going to find out where they went and what took them." "How?" "We're off the case. Hell, we were never officially on it. I'm going to do what those federal agents don't want me to do. I'm going to go into the deep basin, into the areas where people don't usually go, and I'm going to find the source." Fontenot was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "When?" "Tomorrow night, after shift. I've got a John boat I can trailer out to the Henderson access point. Should be able to get deep into the basin before dark." "You're not going alone." Calvin looked at his friend, at a man who'd spent 20 years working these parishes and had earned the right to walk away from trouble. "Eli, you don't have to—" "I know I don't have to, but I'm going. Whatever's out there, it's been taking people from my parish. I'm not going to sit by while it keeps happening." They spent the next day preparing. Calvin gathered equipment, waterproof bags for his phone and camera, emergency flares, a first aid kit. He told the dispatcher he was taking a personal day after his shift ended. Claimed he needed to check on family property in the basin. Fontenot did the same, and at 1730 hours they met at the Henderson boat launch with Calvin's John boat loaded and ready. The basin was quiet as they pushed off, the outboard motor barely disturbing the stillness. They headed south, deeper into the wetlands, following waterways that got narrower and more overgrown as they traveled. Spanish moss hung so low in places that they had to duck to avoid it, and the cypress trees grew so dense that the light filtering through the canopy turned green and dim. Calvin had marked locations on a waterproof map, places where people had gone missing over the past decade, places where the symbols had been found. The pattern formed a rough circle in the deepest part of the basin, an area called the Dead Lakes where the water ran black, and the locals claimed nothing living could survive. They reached the edge of the Dead Lakes as dusk was falling, the light fading fast under the thick canopy. The water here was different, darker, with an oily quality that made Calvin think of pollution, though he knew these areas were too remote for industrial contamination. The smell was different too, not the usual organic decay of the swamp, but something chemical and wrong, like the residue they'd found on the vehicles. "Look at that," Fontenot said quietly, pointing toward a small island maybe 50 yards ahead. Calvin followed his gaze and felt his blood run cold. The island was covered in symbols, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, carved into tree trunks painted on rocks, drawn in the mud of the shore. The 3 wavy lines intersected by a vertical line, repeated over and over in a pattern that suggested obsession or ritual. They beached the John boat and stepped onto the island, their flashlights revealing more details that made the scene more disturbing. The symbols weren't random. They were arranged in specific patterns, forming larger designs that Calvin couldn't quite interpret but that suggested meaning, suggested language. "This is a site," Fontenot said. "Some kind of gathering place or ceremonial location." Calvin moved deeper into the island, following a path that had been cleared through the underbrush. The path led to a clearing at the center of the island, and what they found there made both of them stop cold. There were vehicles, 6 of them, arranged in a circle around a central point. Sedans and trucks and SUVs, all partially sunken into the soft earth, all showing signs of long exposure to the elements. And on each one, painted on the hood or the roof or the doors, were the symbols. Calvin approached the nearest vehicle, a Honda Accord with rust eating through the body panels. He shined his light through the window and saw the interior was full of water and sediment. But there was something else. Something white and waxy, molded into the shape of a human body, but with proportions that were wrong. "It's like a casting," Fontenot said, examining another vehicle. "Like something made a mold using these cars as forms. But what would do that?" Before Calvin could answer, they heard it. The sound they'd heard at both previous scenes, the vocalization that wasn't quite human, but this time it was coming from multiple directions, and it was close. "Back to the boat," Calvin said, his hand going to his weapon. "Now." They moved quickly but not panicking, backing toward where they'd beached the John boat. Calvin swept his flashlight in arcs, looking for the sources of the sounds. And then he saw them. There were 5 of them standing at the edge of the clearing just inside the tree line. Human-shaped but wrong in all the ways Calvin had learned to recognize. Too tall, too thin, with movements that were jerky and mechanical. And their faces, even at this distance, were those same masks of human features arranged incorrectly. The things were watching them with that same impossible stillness, and Calvin realized with horror that they were being evaluated. These things were deciding whether to let them leave, or whether to add them to the collection of vehicles and castings in the clearing. One of the figures stepped forward, and Calvin raised his weapon. "Stay back, Louisiana State Police, stay back." The figure tilted its head in a way that suggested curiosity rather than threat. Then it opened its mouth and spoke. and what came out was the most disturbing thing Calvin had ever heard. Not the alien vocalizations he'd heard before, but words. English words, spoken in a voice that was trying to sound human but couldn't quite manage it. "You see us." The words were stretched out, the syllables wrong, but understandable. Calvin felt his hand shaking on his weapon. "What are you?" he managed to ask. The figure's head tilted further, impossibly far. "We are what remains, what the water makes, what takes and changes." "Where are the people?" "The ones from the vehicles." "They are us. We are them. The water takes. The water gives. We were you. You will be us." Behind Calvin, Fontenot whispered, "Jesus Christ." The figure took another step forward, and the others began to move, spreading out to encircle them. Calvin fired a warning shot into the air, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness. "Stay back!" But the figures didn't stop. They kept moving, their steps synchronized in a way that was too perfect, too coordinated. Calvin and Fontenot backed toward their boat, weapons raised, but they both knew that bullets might not stop whatever these things were. They reached the John boat and pushed off, Calvin yanking the starter cord on the outboard. The engine caught on the third pull, and they accelerated away from the island, the thing standing at the shore watching them go with those green reflecting eyes. Calvin didn't stop until they'd reached the Henderson launch, didn't feel safe until they were back in their trucks with locked doors and the solid world of highways and streetlights around them. But even then, he couldn't shake what he'd heard. "We were you. You will be us." The implication was clear. These things had been human once. The missing people, Loretta Duval, and whoever had been in that Ford fusion and all the others who'd vanished near the basin over the years. They hadn't died. They'd been changed, transformed into something that could live in the deep water, something that mimicked human form but couldn't quite get it right. Calvin drove home in a daze, his mind trying to process what he'd seen and heard. When he arrived at his trailer, he found a note tucked under his door. The handwriting was shaky, barely legible. "They know you were there. They're watching you now. Get out of the basin. Leave Louisiana if you can. Don't end up like me. LD." Calvin felt his blood turn to ice. LD. Loretta Duval. She was still alive. Or what remained of her was still alive. And she was warning him that whatever had happened to her was now going to happen to him. Calvin didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table with his service weapon within reach, staring at the note that had been left under his door. The handwriting was wrong in the same way the faces had been wrong. Too deliberate, too careful, like someone learning to write for the first time. But the message was clear enough. They know you were there. They're watching you now. At 0632 hours, his phone rang. Special Agent Toussaint. "Trooper Broussard, we need to meet, now. There's a diner on Highway 90 just outside Barrack. Be there in 30 minutes and come alone." Calvin made the drive in 25 minutes, watching his mirrors for any sign he was being followed. The diner was one of those old chrome affairs that had been serving the same breakfast for 50 years, and at this hour it was mostly empty except for a few truck drivers and refinery workers coming off night shift. Toussaint was in a back booth, a cup of coffee already cooling in front of her. She looked like she hadn't slept either, dark circles under her eyes and a tension in her shoulders that spoke of someone carrying too much weight. "You went to the island," she said, as Calvin sat down. Not a question, a statement. "How did you know?" "Because 3 other investigators have gone there over the past 6 years. 2 of them are dead. The third one disappeared 4 months ago and turned up in a vehicle in Lake Verret with something wearing his face sitting in the driver's seat. Calvin felt cold spread through his chest. What is this? What are those things? Toussaint pulled out a folder, but her hand hesitated on it. Before I show you this, I need to know if you're prepared to lose everything. Your career, maybe your life, definitely any chance at a normal future. Because once you know what I'm about to tell you, you can't unknow it. And the people who want this kept secret. They have resources and reach that goes beyond anything you can imagine. I've already seen too much to walk away. Toussaint opened the folder. Inside were documents that looked old, some of them dating back to the 1950s. Reports from the Army Corps of Engineers, from Louisiana Department of Wildlife, from agencies Calvin had never heard of. All of them describing the same phenomenon. In 1952, Toussaint said quietly, the Corps of Engineers was doing survey work in the Atchafalaya Basin for a flood control project. They found something in the deep water, something that their instruments couldn't identify. Sonar readings showed structures that shouldn't exist, formations that looked artificial but were too old to have been built by anyone we know of. She turned a page, showing photographs taken from boats. The images were grainy and unclear, but they showed shapes in dark water, tall and thin, moving in ways that didn't look natural. They tried to investigate further, but everyone who went into the deep basin came back changed. Not immediately, but over weeks or months. Personality shifts, memory gaps, physical changes that were subtle at first but became more pronounced over time. Eventually, the project was shut down and classified. The area was marked as environmentally sensitive and access was restricted. But people still go in, Calvin said. Fishermen, hunters, people who've lived here for generations. Most of them stay in the shallows. They know better than to go deep. The locals have stories going back centuries about things in the black water, about people who go into the basin and come back wrong or don't come back at all. What you found on that island, Trooper Broussard, that's not new. It's been happening for as long as people have lived near this water. Calvin thought about the creatures on the island, about their broken speech and their claim that they had been human once. So, what are they? What's in the water that does this? Toussaint shook her head. We don't know. The best theory is some kind of organism, maybe microscopic, that infects human tissue and alters it over time. But samples we've collected don't match anything in any biological database. It's like nothing we've ever encountered. And the federal agents, the ones who keep taking control of scenes, they're from a joint task force that exists to contain and suppress information about the phenomenon. Their job isn't to investigate or solve anything. It's to make sure the public never finds out what's in the basin, because if they did, there would be panic. Mass evacuations, economic collapse in the region, maybe worse. Calvin leaned back, trying to process everything. So they're just going to let it keep happening? Let people keep disappearing and turning into those things? They don't have a choice. They can't stop it. They've tried. Quarantine measures, chemical treatments, even considered draining entire sections of the basin. Nothing works. The organisms, or whatever they are, they're too widespread, too resilient. All the task force can do is damage control. Calvin pulled out his phone and showed Toussaint the note he'd received. Loretta Duval left this for me, which means she's still conscious, still aware of what she was. How is that possible if she's been transformed? Toussaint's expression grew grim. That's the worst part. They stay conscious. They're aware of what's happening to them as their bodies change, as their minds start working differently. Some of them fight it, try to warn people like Loretta did. Others embrace it, become something that's not human anymore in any meaningful sense. How long do I have? The question hung in the air between them. Toussaint met his eyes. "I don't know. You were exposed to the water. You breathed air that had those organisms in it. You touched surfaces that were contaminated. It might never affect you. Your immune system might fight it off. Or you might start noticing changes in a week, a month, a year. There's no way to predict." Calvin felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. Everything he'd seen, everything he'd learned, it all came down to this. He'd been infected by something that might slowly turn him into one of those things on the island, and there was nothing he could do about it. There has to be something. Treatment, medication, something. There isn't. We've tried everything. The only thing that seems to slow the progression is staying away from the basin, avoiding any further exposure. But even that only delays it. Once you're infected, it's just a matter of time. Calvin stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "I can't accept that. There has to be a way to stop this." "There isn't," Toussaint said again, and her voice carried the weight of someone who'd fought the same battle and lost. "The best you can do is document everything you've seen, pass that information to people who'll continue the investigation after you, and try to live whatever time you have left as normally as possible." Calvin walked out of the diner into morning sunlight that felt wrong somehow. Too bright, too normal for a world where people could be transformed into something inhuman by water that looked like any other bayou. He sat in his truck for a long time, trying to decide what to do next. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "I know what you found. Meet me at the old Thibodeau fish camp on Bayou Benoit tonight at 2100 hours. Come alone. I can help. LD." Calvin stared at the message. Loretta Duval wanted to meet him, wanted to help. But how much of her was still human? How much of what she'd become could be trusted? He called Fontenot. "Eli, I need you to do something for me. If I don't check in by 2200 hours tonight, I need you to go to Special Agent Toussaint and tell her everything. Everything we saw on the island, everything we found. Can you do that?" There was a long pause. "Calvin, what are you planning?" "I'm going to meet with Loretta Duval, or what she's become. She says she can help." "That's insane. You saw what those things are. You can't trust them. I don't have a choice. If there's any chance she knows something that can stop this, I have to take it." Fontenot was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm coming with you." "No. If this goes wrong, someone needs to survive to tell the story. That has to be you. Calvin, please, Eli. I need to know someone will continue this if I can't." Another long pause. "Okay, but you check in at 2200 hours. If I don't hear from you, I'm coming in with every unit we have." Calvin spent the day preparing. He wrote out everything he knew, every detail of the investigation, every piece of evidence he'd collected. He made copies and hid them in 3 different locations. He uploaded his photos and videos to cloud storage under an anonymous account. If he disappeared, if he became one of those things on the island, at least the information would survive. At 2030 hours, he drove to the old Thibodeau fish camp, a dilapidated structure on stilts overlooking Bayou Benoit. The camp had been abandoned for years, and the access road was barely passable. Calvin parked his truck and approached on foot, his flashlight cutting through darkness that was thick with fog rolling off the bayou. The camp looked empty, windows dark, door hanging open. But Calvin could see fresh footprints in the mud leading up to the porch, and there was a light inside, faint and flickering like a candle. "Loretta?" he called out. "It's Trooper Broussard. You wanted to meet?" For a moment, nothing. Then a voice from inside the camp, and Calvin's blood ran cold because it was human and not human at the same time. The words clear, but the tone wrong. Come in, Trooper, slowly. I won't hurt you. Calvin climbed the steps to the porch, his hand on his weapon. The interior of the camp was lit by several candles arranged on a table, and sitting in a chair facing the door was Loretta Duval, or what remained of her. She looked human from a distance, but as Calvin's eyes adjusted to the light, he could see the changes. Her skin had that same waxy quality he'd seen on the things in the vehicles. Her movements were too careful, too precise, and her eyes, when they caught the candlelight, reflected green. "Thank you for coming," she said, and her voice was clearer than the creatures on the island had been, but still carried that wrong quality. "I know what you're thinking. You're wondering how much of me is still Loretta and how much is something else. Are you still you?" She smiled, and it was the saddest thing Calvin had ever seen. "Mostly, for now, but I can feel myself changing more every day. My thoughts working differently, my body responding to things that shouldn't affect me. In another month, maybe 2, I'll be like the others on the island, unable to pretend anymore." "Why did you want to meet?" "Because you're infected too. I can tell. I can smell it on you, the way the water has marked you. And because you deserve to know the truth before you start changing." Calvin felt his stomach drop. "What truth?" Loretta stood up, moving to the window that overlooked the bayou. "The things in the basin, they're not alien. They're not some unknown organism. They're human, all of them. But they're human that went so deep into the water, stayed so long in the darkness that they evolved into something else. Something that can survive in places where normal humans can't. That's impossible. Evolution takes millions of years. Not if something is accelerating it. Not if there's something in that water that rewrites DNA, that pushes adaptation to happen in weeks instead of millennia." She turned to face him. "The basin is doing this deliberately. It's changing us, making us into something that can live in both worlds, water and land, human and other." Calvin's mind was reeling. "Why? I don't know. Maybe it's defense. Maybe the basin is alive in some way we don't understand, and it's protecting itself by turning intruders into guardians. Or maybe it's just what happens when humans interact with something that's been here longer than we have, something that operates by rules we don't comprehend. There has to be a way to stop it, to reverse the changes." Loretta shook her head. "There isn't. I've tried everything. Stayed away from the water, taken every medication I could find, even considered more extreme measures. Nothing works. Once the water marks you, you belong to it. The only choice is how you handle the transformation." "What do you mean?" "Some people fight it. They try to stay human as long as possible. And when they finally change completely, they lose themselves. They become like the things on the island, aware, but not conscious, acting on instinct rather than thought. Others accept it, let the change happen gradually, and they keep more of themselves. They stay aware, stay capable of making choices." Calvin felt horror wash over him. "You're saying I should accept becoming one of those things?" "I'm saying you should prepare yourself for what's coming. Because it is coming, Trooper Broussard. You saw too much, stayed too long in contaminated areas. The water has you now. The only question is whether you'll fight it and lose yourself, or accept it and keep some part of who you are." "I won't accept that. I'll find a way to stop it." Loretta's smile was sad. "That's what I said 5 years ago. Look at me now." She moved closer, and in the candlelight Calvin could see more details of her transformation. The way her fingers were too long, the way her skin seemed to shift colors slightly in the light, the way her eyes didn't blink as often as they should. "I'm leaving Louisiana tonight," she said, "going somewhere far from water, somewhere dry and safe. It won't stop the changes, but it might slow them down. Give me a few more months of being mostly human. That's all any of us can hope for. What about the others? The people who are going to be taken, who are going to be changed? They're beyond your help. The task force knows about the island, about the vehicles, about everything they've known for decades. They've decided that containing the information is more important than saving the individuals, and they have the power to make that decision stick. Calvin pulled out his phone. I have evidence. Photos, videos, documentation. I can go public, force them to acknowledge this. And they'll destroy your credibility, manufacture evidence that you're unstable, maybe worse. They've done it before to people who tried to expose this. The information gets buried, the whistleblower gets discredited or disappeared, and nothing changes. So I do nothing. I just accept that people are going to keep vanishing. Loretta moved to the door. You do what I'm doing. You survive. You document what you can, pass the information to people you trust, and you try to stay human as long as possible. That's all any of us can do. She stepped out onto the porch, and Calvin followed. The bayou was alive with sound, frogs and insects and the splash of things moving through water. In the distance, Calvin could see lights reflecting off the surface, and he realized with horror that they were eyes. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, watching from the darkness. They're always watching now, Loretta said. Once you've seen them, once you've been marked, they never stop. They're waiting to see what you'll become, waiting to welcome you home. She walked down the steps and disappeared into the fog, moving with that same wrong grace he'd seen in the creatures on the island. Calvin stood alone on the porch, surrounded by watching eyes, and understood with terrible clarity that his life as he'd known it was over. He drove back to Henderson, checked in with Fontenot at 21:59 hours to confirm he was alive, and went home to his trailer. He sat at his kitchen table and wrote out his final report documenting everything he'd seen and learned. Not the sanitized version for official files, but the truth. At 03:12 hours, he heard a sound outside his trailer, the same vocalization he'd heard at the vehicles, the note that wasn't quite human. He looked out his window and saw them standing in the darkness beyond his porch light. 5 figures, tall and thin, with eyes that reflected green. They weren't approaching, weren't threatening, just watching, waiting. Calvin understood what they were waiting for. They were waiting for him to change, to become one of them. And he knew, with the certainty that comes from seeing impossible things, that they would keep waiting, keep watching, until the water finally claimed what it had marked. He thought about running, about leaving Louisiana and trying to start over somewhere far from bayous and fog, but he knew it wouldn't matter. The infection was in him now, rewriting his cells, changing him from the inside out. Wherever he went, whatever he did, eventually he would become something that looked human but wasn't, something that lived in the spaces between water and land, between human and other. Calvin pulled out his phone and looked at the photos he'd taken. The island, the vehicles, the creatures. Evidence that should matter, that should change everything. But he knew it wouldn't. The task force would suppress it, discredit him, make sure the truth never reached the public. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was bearing witness. Documenting what happened even if no one believed it. Leaving a record for whoever came after him, whoever tried to investigate the disappearances in the vehicles and the things that watched from the darkness. He copied everything to a flash drive and mailed it to Fontenot with instructions to pass it on if Calvin disappeared or changed. Then he wrote one final note. To whoever finds this, the Atchafalaya Basin is alive. It takes people and changes them into something else. The government knows, and they're covering it up. Don't go into the deep water. Don't stay too long near the black lakes. And if you see the symbols, the 3 wavy lines crossed by a vertical line, run. Because once you've seen them, the water knows you're there, and it will come for you. I don't know how much longer I'll be human. I can already feel the changes starting. Subtle shifts in how my body responds to things, how my thoughts work. Maybe I'll fight it and lose myself. Maybe I'll accept it and keep some part of who I was. Either way, I'm going to keep documenting as long as I can. Someone needs to bear witness. If you're reading this, you're probably investigating a disappearance or a strange vehicle sighting. You're probably asking questions that people don't want to answer. Be careful. The water is patient, and it has ways of marking those who get too close. And if you start to notice changes in yourself, if your thoughts start working differently or your body starts responding to things that shouldn't affect you, don't fight it too hard. Accept what's coming and try to keep as much of yourself as possible. Because the alternative is losing everything at once. The basin takes what it wants. All we can do is witness and remember. Trooper Calvin Broussard, Louisiana State Police, Troop 1. Calvin sealed the note in an envelope and added it to the evidence package. Then he sat at his table and waited for dawn, watching through his window as the figures in the darkness waited with him. 3 weeks later, Calvin's truck was found abandoned at a boat launch on Lake Foss Point. His phone and wallet were on the seat, his weapon secured in its case. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence of foul play. Deputy Eli Fontenot filed a missing person report, but no investigation was ever opened. 6 weeks after that, a fisherman reported seeing a state police cruiser partially submerged in the water off Old Spanish Trail. When units responded, they found Calvin's patrol car sitting in 3 feet of water, and in the driver's seat was a figure wearing a Louisiana State Police uniform. The figure was removed from the vehicle and taken to an undisclosed location. The official report stated that Trooper Calvin Broussard had died in a single-vehicle accident, cause undetermined. The case was closed within 48 hours. But Deputy Fontenot knew better. He'd seen the photographs in the evidence package Calvin had sent him. He'd read the final note. And one night, driving past Old Spanish Trail, he saw them standing in the water. Dozens of figures, tall and thin, with eyes that reflected green in his headlights. And standing among them, wearing the torn remnants of a state police uniform, was someone who looked like Calvin Broussard. The figure raised one hand in what might have been a wave or might have been a warning, and then sank beneath the surface, disappearing into water that ran black and held secrets that the state of Louisiana had decided were better left buried. Fontenot kept driving, kept his eyes on the road, kept his mouth shut about what he'd seen. Because he understood now what Calvin had understood. Some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. Some horrors were too vast to fight. The Atchafalaya Basin stretched out in the darkness, patient and alive, waiting for the next person who would venture too deep, stay too long, see too much. Waiting to mark them and change them and add them to its collection of witnesses who could never leave. And somewhere in those black waters, in the places where light never reached, and the cypress trees grew so thick that the world above seemed like a distant memory, Calvin Broussard swam with the others. Still conscious, still aware, still bearing witness to the impossible truth that the state would never acknowledge. The radio had been acting strange for 3 nights running, and Trooper Marshal Thibodeau was starting to think it wasn't equipment malfunction. Static was normal in Lafourche Parish, where the wetlands played hell with radio frequencies and the infrastructure was old enough that dead zones were just part of the job. But this was different. This was static that had patterns, rhythms that almost sounded like words if you listened long enough in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. Marshall had been working the graveyard shift in Lafourche for 7 years. patrolling the stretch of Highway 1 that ran through Thibodaux and down toward Golden Meadow, through country where sugarcane fields gave way to marsh and the Gulf of Mexico was more a presence than a destination. He knew every mile of his territory, every back road and boat launch, every place where trouble liked to gather when decent people were asleep. It was 0143 hours on a Thursday morning in October when the static resolved into something that made Marshall's hands tighten on the steering wheel. Unit, requesting, backup, Parish Road, coordinates. The voice was male, young, breaking up through interference that sounded like it was coming from underwater. Suspect is armed and multiple shots fired. Marshall grabbed his radio. Central, this is Unit 23. Did you copy that transmission? I have an officer requesting backup, but the signal is breaking up. Can you identify the unit? Silence. Then the night dispatcher, a woman named Clarice Boudreau, who'd been working Central for 15 years, came back with confusion in her voice. Unit 23, I didn't copy any transmission. Your channel has been clear for the last 30 minutes. Marshall felt cold settle in his chest. Central, I just heard a clear distress call. Male officer requesting backup on Parish Road, gave partial coordinates. You're telling me you didn't receive that? Negative, Unit 23. No other units are currently transmitting. Are you having radio issues? Do you need to return to station for equipment check? Before Marshall could respond, the voice came through again. Louder this time, clearer. Unit 47 to Central. Officer down. I repeat, officer down. Need immediate medical assistance. Parish Road 24 near the Leeville Junction. Marshall's blood ran cold. Unit 47. That designation hadn't been used in Lafourche Parish in 12 years, not since Trooper Tommy LaRue had gone missing on a routine patrol in 2011. Tommy had been 26 years old, 3 years into his career, working the same graveyard shift Marshall worked now. He'd called in a traffic stop on Parish Road 24 near the Leeville Junction, and then nothing. No further transmissions, no signs of struggle, just a patrol car found abandoned with the engine running and the driver's door open. They'd searched for Tommy for 3 weeks, dragged every canal and bayou within 10 miles, interviewed every resident, checked every hunting camp and fishing shack. Nothing. Tommy LaRue had vanished as completely as if the marsh had opened up and swallowed him whole. The case was still technically open, but after 12 years with no leads and no body, everyone knew it was never getting solved. Central, Unit 23, Marshall said, his voice carefully controlled. I'm copying a transmission from Unit 47, requesting immediate backup to Parish Road 24 near the Leeville Junction. A longer pause this time. Then Clarice came back, and her voice had changed. Unit 23, there is no Unit 47. That designation was retired in 2011. Are you feeling all right? Do you need to end your shift? I know what I'm hearing, Clarice. Someone is transmitting on Tommy LaRue's old call sign. Marshall. She dropped the official protocol, used his first name, which she never did on the radio. There's nothing on this end. Your channel is clear. Whatever you're hearing, it's not coming through Central. Marshall pulled over to the shoulder and put the car in park. The static was getting worse, filling his radio with white noise that rose and fell like breathing. And underneath it, he could hear Tommy's voice, younger than Marshall remembered, scared in a way that made Marshall's training scream that this was wrong. The suspect is approaching my position. I've lost visual on my vehicle. Central, do you copy? I'm on foot in the marsh. I can see lights, but they're not moving right. Marshall grabbed his personal phone and called Sheriff Warren Guidry directly. The sheriff answered on the third ring, his voice rough with sleep. This better be important, Thibodaux. Sheriff, I'm hearing radio transmissions from Tommy LaRue. Silence. Then, say that again. I'm parked on Highway 1 near the Raceland exit, and I'm hearing transmissions on my radio from someone using Unit 47 call sign. Distress calls from Parish Road 24 near Leeville. Dispatch says they're not receiving anything, but I'm hearing it clear as day. What's the transmission saying? Marshall told him. Every detail. The request for backup, the officer down call, the descriptions that matched Tommy's last known location. When he finished, Guidry was quiet for a long moment. Stay where you are. I'm calling this in to the State Police Criminal Investigation Division. Don't go to that location. Don't follow up on those transmissions. Just stay put until I get there. Sheriff, if there's any chance Tommy is still alive, Tommy LaRue has been dead for 12 years, Guidry said, and his voice carried the weight of someone who'd accepted a hard truth long ago. Whatever you're hearing, it's not him. It's not possible. But Marshall knew what he'd heard. He'd worked alongside Tommy for 2 years before the disappearance, knew his voice, knew his radio cadence. This wasn't some random interference or crossed signal. This was Tommy LaRue calling for help from a place 12 years in the past or somewhere else entirely. The static surged again, and this time what came through made Marshall's skin crawl. They're in the water. They're all around me. Central. They're not human. They're... The transmission cut off with a sound that wasn't static, wasn't interference, but something wet and final. Then silence, complete and absolute, like someone had thrown a switch and cut all sound from the universe. Marshall sat in his patrol car, hands shaking, trying to process what he'd just heard. Every instinct he had was screaming to go to Parish Road 24, to investigate, to try to find some trace of what had happened. But Guidry's words echoed in his head. Don't go to that location. His radio crackled back to life with Clarice's voice, normal and professional. Unit 23 Central. Sheriff Guidry advises you to return to station and file an incident report. He's en route to meet you there. Copy that, Central, returning to station. Marshall drove back to the parish sheriff's office in Thibodaux, a low brick building that had been serving the parish for 40 years and looked every day of it. The parking lot was empty except for Guidry's truck, already there despite Marshall arriving first. The sheriff must have driven at speeds that would have gotten anyone else pulled over. Inside, Guidry was waiting in the conference room with coffee and a folder that looked old and worn, like it had been opened and closed hundreds of times. The sheriff was in his 60s, weathered and competent, with eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything but that still showed concern when Marshall walked in. Sit down, Guidry said. Tell me exactly what you heard, word for word, if you can remember. Marshall went through it again. Every transmission, every word that had come through the static. Guidry listened without interrupting, making notes in a small leather journal. When Marshall finished, the sheriff opened the folder and spread its contents across the table. Inside were crime scene photos from Tommy LaRue's disappearance. The abandoned patrol car, the open door, the radio still functioning but silent. Reports from search teams, interviews with witnesses who'd seen nothing, technical analysis of the vehicle that showed no signs of struggle or foul play. And at the bottom of the pile, a transcript. Marshall picked it up and felt his blood turn to ice. It was a transcript of radio transmissions, dated October 23, 2011. Tommy LaRue's last recorded communications. And the words were identical, word for word, to what Marshall had just heard on his radio. How is this possible? Marshall asked. Guidry leaned back in his chair. You're the fourth officer to report hearing these transmissions. First one was 3 years after Tommy disappeared. Trooper named Baptiste Arsenault, working the same shift you work now, same stretch of highway. He came in reporting that he'd heard Tommy calling for backup. We thought he was having some kind of breakdown, stress maybe. Suggested he take some time off. And the others? 2 more over the past 8 years. Different officers, different times, but always the same thing. Tommy's voice on the radio calling for help, transmitting his last known messages, and always on the anniversary of his disappearance. Marshall checked his phone. October 23rd. 12 years to the day since Tommy LaRue had vanished. So, this is some kind of, what, echo? Residual transmission? Guidry shook his head. If it was just old radio signals somehow repeating, Central would pick them up. The equipment would show transmission activity, but according to dispatch, your radio has been completely silent except for normal traffic. Whatever you're hearing, it's not coming through official channels. Then where is it coming from? That's what we've been trying to figure out for 12 years. Guidry pulled out another document. This one marked with a state police seal. After the third officer reported these transmissions, we brought in a specialist from the Louisiana State Police Technical Division, forensic audio analyst named Dr. Amelie Robichaud. She spent 3 weeks studying the phenomenon. What did she find? Nothing that made sense. She set up monitoring equipment, analyzed every radio frequency used by parish law enforcement, even brought in equipment that could detect the faintest electromagnetic signals. On the anniversary, when we had 2 officers on patrol, specifically listening for the transmissions, she recorded something, but it wasn't radio waves. Guidry pulled out a technical report so full of jargon that Marshall could barely understand it. But one phrase jumped out at him. Unexplained acoustic phenomenon, inconsistent with known transmission methods. She said whatever was carrying Tommy's voice, it wasn't radio, Guidry continued. It was something else, something that could interface with radio equipment but wasn't electromagnetic in nature. Her recommendation was to treat it as an unsolved technical mystery and advise officers to ignore any transmissions they might hear. But that's not what you think, is it? Guidry met his eyes. I think Tommy LaRue encountered something on Parish Road 24 that night. Something that took him, and that's still out there. And I think once a year, on the anniversary, something broadcasts his last moments. Not as a recording, but as, I don't know, a warning, maybe, or a lure. Marshall felt cold spread through him. You think whatever took Tommy is still active. I know it is, because Tommy wasn't the first to disappear from that area, and he wasn't the last. Guidry pulled out a map of Lafourche Parish, and on it were marked red X's, locations where people had gone missing over the past 30 years. The X's formed a pattern, a rough circle around the Leeville Junction area, and at the center of the circle was Parish Road 24. 16 disappearances in 30 years, Guidry said. Fishermen, hunters, a few tourists who took wrong turns. Most of them were written off as accidents, people falling into canals or getting lost in the marsh and succumbing to exposure. But 3 of them were law enforcement. Tommy was the most recent, but there were 2 others before him. Deputy Jacques Melançon in 97, and before him, a wildlife officer named Celestin Boudreau in 1989. Marshall looked at the map, at the pattern that was too regular to be coincidence. What's at the center? What's actually at that junction? Nothing now. It used to be a small settlement called Leeville Station, back in the 30s and 40s. Maybe 20 families, mostly people who worked the oil fields when they were first opening up the Gulf. Place was abandoned after Hurricane Audrey in 1957. The storm surge wiped it clean, and nobody ever rebuilt. So what's there now? Ruins, foundations, some pilings from old houses, a few cisterns that didn't collapse. And in the center, there's an old freshwater well that the settlement used. Been dry for decades, capped off by the parish in the 70s for safety reasons. Marshall studied the map, the circle of disappearances, the well at the center. Something about the pattern felt intentional. like someone or something was marking territory. "I want to go there," Marshall said. "During daylight, fully equipped with backup. I want to see what's at that location." Guidry was quiet for a long moment. "I can't stop you from investigating, but I can tell you that every officer who's gone to that site during or after hearing the transmissions has reported experiences, strange sensations, audio hallucinations, feelings of being watched. 2 of them requested transfers to other parishes. 1 retired early and moved out of state. But nobody's disappeared since Tommy. Not law enforcement, but a fisherman went missing near there in 2016. His boat was found drifting in the bayou, engine still running, his tackle box open like he'd just been fishing. No body, no signs of struggle. Just gone." Marshall looked at the crime scene photos of Tommy's patrol car, at the open door and the empty driver's seat. He thought about the voice he'd heard on the radio, young and scared, calling for help that never came. "If there's any chance of finding out what happened to Tommy, I have to take it." Guidry nodded slowly. "Okay, but you're not going alone, and you're not going at night. We'll organize a proper investigation team. State police, maybe some federal resources if we can justify it. And you're going to wear recording equipment that documents everything you see and hear." "When?" "I'll make some calls tomorrow. We'll aim for this weekend. Full daylight, multiple units. Until then, you finish your shift, go home, and try to get some sleep. And if you hear those transmissions again..." He paused. "Don't respond to them. Don't follow instructions you might hear. Whatever is broadcasting Tommy's voice, it's not trying to help you." Marshall finished his shift without further incident. The radio stayed clear, just normal traffic and the occasional check-in from Central. But as dawn broke over the parish and he drove home to his apartment in Thibodaux, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something in the marsh knew he'd heard the transmissions and was waiting to see what he'd do about it. He tried to sleep, but couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard Tommy's voice. "They're in the water. They're all around me. They're not human." At 14:23 hours, his phone rang. Sheriff Guidry. "Marshall, I've got some information you need to hear. Can you come back to the office?" Marshall drove back to the sheriff's office, finding Guidry in his private office with a woman he didn't recognize. She was in her 40s, professional-looking, with sharp eyes and a briefcase that probably cost more than Marshall made in a month. "Trooper Thibodaux, this is Dr. Amélie Robichaud. She's the forensic audio analyst I mentioned. She drove up from Baton Rouge when I told her you'd heard the transmissions." Dr. Robichaud stood and shook Marshall's hand. Her grip was firm, confident. "Trooper Thibodaux, I've been studying this phenomenon for 9 years, and I'd like to ask you some questions about what you heard last night." They sat, and Marshall went through it again. Dr. Robichaud listened intently, occasionally making notes, but mostly just focused on his words with the kind of attention that made Marshall feel like every detail mattered. When he finished, she pulled out a laptop and played an audio file. Marshall recognized Tommy's voice immediately, the same transmissions he'd heard on his radio, but this recording was clearer, more complete. "This is what I recorded 3 years ago," Robichaud said. "Using specialized equipment positioned along Highway 1 near where you were parked last night. The audio you're hearing isn't coming through radio frequencies. It's something else. Something that I can only describe as sound that exists in a space between frequencies. Sound that shouldn't be possible according to our current understanding of physics." "What does that mean?" "It means whatever is generating these transmissions isn't using technology. It's using something natural, something that can manipulate acoustic waves in ways we don't understand. And the pattern, the repetition, the fact that it only happens on the anniversary suggests something that has purpose, that has intention." Marshall felt his scalp prickle. "You're saying something intelligent is broadcasting these messages. I'm saying that the phenomenon exhibits signs of intelligence and deliberate action. Whether that intelligence is human or something else, I can't determine from audio analysis alone. Guidry leaned forward. Dr. Robichaud has agreed to accompany us to the Leeville Junction site. She'll bring her equipment, document everything we experience. If there's something there that's generating these transmissions, we're going to find it. When do we go? Saturday morning, 0800 hours. State Police is sending 2 additional units. We'll have parish deputies as backup, and Dr. Robichaud will have her team. We go in prepared, we document everything, and we don't take unnecessary risks. Marshall nodded, but his mind was already at Parish Road 24, imagining what they might find. The ruins of Leeville Station, the capped well, and whatever had taken Tommy LaRue 12 years ago on a night when the marsh was full of things that shouldn't exist. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of oppressive humidity that promised storms later in the day. Marshall met the assembled team at the parish sheriff's office at 0745 hours, finding a group that looked more like a military operation than a standard investigation. Sheriff Guidry had brought 2 of his deputies, both armed and carrying equipment for water rescue if needed. The Louisiana State Police had sent Trooper Evangeline Gautreau and Trooper Marcus Bergeron, both veterans with experience in search and recovery operations. And Dr. Robichaud had arrived with a van full of equipment that looked like something from a science fiction movie. "All right, listen up," Guidry said, spreading a detailed map across the hood of his truck. "We're going to Parish Road 24, specifically to the old Leeville Station site. It's about a 40-minute drive, and the last 5 miles are on unmaintained roads that flood regularly. We travel in convoy. Nobody separates from the group. Dr. Robichaud's team will set up monitoring equipment while we conduct a visual search of the area." Marshall studied the map. The Leeville Junction was marked with a red circle, and around it were notations in Guidry's handwriting. Melanson last seen 987. Tommy's vehicle found here 2011. Fishing boat drifted from this point 2016. Each notation was like a tombstone for someone who'd vanished into the marsh. "What exactly are we looking for?" Trooper Gautreau asked. She was in her early 30s, competent and direct, with the kind of eyes that missed nothing. "Anything unusual," Guidry said. "Structures that shouldn't be there, signs of recent activity, anything that might explain the disappearances or the radio transmissions. Dr. Robichaud will be monitoring for electromagnetic anomalies and acoustic phenomena. If we hear anything, see anything, or feel anything unusual, we document it and we stay together." They loaded into their vehicles and formed a convoy. Marshall rode with Guidry in the lead truck, followed by the 2 state police cruisers, then Dr. Robichaud's van, with the 2 deputies bringing up the rear. They drove south on Highway 1, through Thibodaux and Raceland, past the point where sugarcane fields gave way to marsh, and the air took on that particular smell of salt water and decay that meant you were getting close to the Gulf. Parish Road 24 turned off Highway 1 just past Golden Meadow, a 2-lane strip of cracked asphalt that immediately felt wrong. The trees pressed in close on both sides, live oaks draped with Spanish moss that hung so low it scraped the tops of their vehicles. The marsh water on either side was dark, almost black, and perfectly still despite the morning breeze. "This is where Tommy called in his last traffic stop," Guidry said, pointing to a wide spot in the road. He reported pulling over a vehicle with expired tags, said he was approaching the driver. That was at 0147 hours. At 0152, he transmitted the distress calls you heard. At 0153, all communication ceased. Marshall looked at the spot, trying to imagine what Tommy had encountered. A routine traffic stop, something every officer did dozens of times a shift, and then something had gone catastrophically wrong. They continued down the road, and Marshall felt the atmosphere change. The air got heavier, harder to breathe, and the light filtering through the trees took on a greenish quality that made everything look diseased. His radio, which had been silent except for occasional check-ins from the convoy, began to fill with static. "Anyone else getting interference?" Trooper Bergeron's voice came through the static, concerned. "Affirmative," Marshall responded. "Central, do you copy? We're experiencing radio interference." There was no response from dispatch, just static that rose and fell with that same rhythmic quality Marshall had heard 3 nights ago. The quality that sounded like breathing. Dr. Robichaud's voice came through on a different channel, using the backup frequency they'd established. "I'm reading massive electromagnetic fluctuations. Whatever is causing the radio interference, it's localized to this area, and it's getting stronger as we approach the junction." The road got worse. Potholes and cracks giving way to sections where water had washed away the asphalt entirely, leaving muddy tracks that tested the suspension of their vehicles. They passed the ruins of what had been houses, concrete foundations now half submerged in standing water, stairs that led to doorways that no longer existed. The remnants of Leeville Station, abandoned for 66 years but still marking the landscape like scars. The road ended at a clearing maybe 200 yards across. In the center stood the well, just as Guidry had described it. A circular structure of old brick, maybe 4 feet high and 5 feet across, with an iron cap bolted down over the opening. Around it, arranged in what Marshall realized with growing unease was a perfect circle, were markers. Not gravestones, but something else. Wooden posts driven into the ground, each carved with symbols that Marshall didn't recognize. The convoy parked at the edge of the clearing and everyone got out. The silence was immediate and wrong. No birds, no insects, no sound of wind through the trees. Just silence so complete it felt like pressure against Marshall's eardrums. "Jesus," Gautreau whispered. "What is this place?" Dr. Robichaud was already moving, pulling equipment from her van. She set up sensors in a perimeter around the clearing, each one connected wirelessly to her laptop. Her assistant, a young man named Laurent Hebert, helped her position microphones on tripods at precise intervals. "The acoustic signature here is unlike anything I've recorded before," Dr. Robichaud said, studying her laptop screen. "It's as if the sound is being absorbed by something. Normal environmental noise should register at 40 to 50 decibels. This is reading 15. That's quieter than a recording studio." Marshall approached the well, studying the iron cap. It was old, rust-eaten, but the bolts holding it down looked newer. Someone had been maintaining this seal, keeping the well closed. "Sheriff, when did you say the parish capped this well?" 1973. After a kid almost fell in during a hunting trip with his father. The parish deemed it a hazard and sealed it. These bolts are newer than that. Someone's been replacing them. Guidry moved closer, examining the bolts. "You're right. These can't be more than 10, 15 years old, which means someone's been coming out here regularly to maintain this seal." Before Marshall could respond, Dr. Robichaud called out. "I'm picking up something. Audio transmission. Same frequency signature as the phenomenon from Thursday night. It's faint, but it's there." They gathered around her laptop. On the screen was a waveform display showing sound frequencies. Most of the display was flat, showing the unnatural silence of the clearing. But in one narrow band, there was activity, waves that pulsed with regular rhythm, carrying something that the equipment was struggling to decode. Dr. Robichaud adjusted her settings, and suddenly they could hear it. Not through their radios this time, but through her speakers, Tommy LaRue's voice, faint and distant, as if coming from very far away or very deep below. "Can't get back to my vehicle. They're following me. Central, I need immediate backup. The transmission cut off, replaced by static. Then another voice, older, with a different accent. Dispatch, this is Deputy Melanson. I've lost visual on the suspect, heading toward the old well. There's something wrong with the water here. That voice cut off too, replaced by a third. Wildlife unit requesting assistance. I can see lights in the water. They're moving wrong. Something's coming up from below. 3 voices, 3 different time periods, all transmitting from this location, all describing the same thing. Something in the water. Something that moved wrong. Something that came up from below. Marshall looked at the well, at the iron cap that someone had been maintaining for decades. We need to open it. Absolutely not, Guidry said immediately. We don't know what's down there. That's exactly why we need to look. 3 officers have disappeared from this location, and all of them mentioned water and something coming from below. This well is the only water source in the immediate area. Dr. Robichaux looked up from her equipment. The transmissions are definitely originating from underground. If I had to estimate depth based on the signal degradation, I'd say they're coming from at least 50 feet below us. That well should only be 30, 40 feet deep at most. So the transmissions are coming from deeper than the well goes, Gautreaux said. Which means there's something else down there. Something that connects to the well but goes deeper. Marshall made a decision. He grabbed a tire iron from his truck and approached the well. Guidry tried to stop him, but Marshall was already working on the first bolt, feeling it resist, and then give way with a screech of metal on metal that sounded obscenely loud in the silence. Marshall, stop. We need to think about this. I've been thinking about this for 3 days. Tommy LaRue was my friend. If there's any chance of finding out what happened to him, I have to take it. The second bolt came off, then the third. The fourth and final bolt was harder, corroded in place, but Marshall put his weight into it and felt it break free. The iron cap was heavy, but with Bergeron's help they lifted it off and set it aside. The smell that rose from the well made everyone step back. Not the expected smell of stagnant water, but something chemical and organic mixed together. Something that made Marshall think of the basin, of deep water that never saw sunlight, of things that lived in darkness and had adapted to it. Marshall shined his flashlight down into the well. The beam cut through darkness, showing brick walls slick with moisture and algae. The water level was maybe 20 feet down, black and still. But it wasn't the water that made Marshall's breath catch. It was what was floating in it. Objects, dozens of them suspended just below the surface. At first, Marshall thought they were debris, but as his eyes adjusted, he realized they were too regular, too deliberately arranged. They were radios, old police radios, the kind used decades ago, all floating in a circle around the center of the well. "Dr. Robichaux," Marshall called. "You need to see this." She came to the edge with her equipment, positioning a camera on a telescoping pole to get a better look. The live feed showed up on her laptop, and what they saw made everyone go silent. The radios weren't just floating, they were active. Small lights blinked on their displays, and through Dr. Robichaux's equipment they could hear them all transmitting. Not voices, but the static that had been filling Marshall's radio. All of them broadcasting the same signal, synchronized perfectly, creating an acoustic pattern that shouldn't be possible. "This is incredible," Dr. Robichaux whispered. "They're forming some kind of array, amplifying and focusing the signal. But there's no power source. These radios should be dead, but they're all functioning. How?" Gautreaux asked. "I don't know. The water, maybe? Some kind of chemical reaction, or..." She trailed off, adjusting her sensors. I'm reading electrical activity coming from deeper in the well, below the water line. Something is powering these radios. Marshall looked at Guidry. We need to go down there. With what equipment? We don't have diving gear, and I'm not sending anyone into water we know nothing about. Then we drop a camera. Dr. Robichaux, can your equipment handle that? She looked uncertain. I have a waterproof camera that can go to about 60 feet, but if there's something electrical in the water, it might short out. Try it. Dr. Robichaux set up a camera on a cable, waterproofed and equipped with its own lights. They lowered it slowly into the well, past the floating radios, into the black water below. The feed showed murky darkness at first, sediment swirling in the camera's lights. Then the brick walls of the well came into view, covered in growth that looked more like coral than algae. At 30 feet, the well's walls ended, but the shaft continued, widening into something that looked artificial. Concrete walls, reinforced with metal beams, descending into darkness that the camera's lights couldn't fully penetrate. This isn't a well, Marshall said. This is an access shaft. Someone built this deliberately. They lowered the camera deeper. 40 feet, 50, 60. The walls showed signs of construction that looked military or industrial. Pipes ran along the walls, thick and corroded. Occasional openings suggested chambers branching off from the main shaft. At 70 feet, the cable jerked violently. Everyone grabbed it, trying to keep control, but something below was pulling hard. The feed from the camera showed movement, something large passing in front of the lens too fast to identify. "Pull it up!" Guidry shouted. They hauled on the cable, but the resistance was tremendous. Whatever had grabbed the camera wasn't letting go easily. Marshall wrapped the cable around his hands and pulled, feeling something pull back with strength that was definitely not human. The cable went slack suddenly, and they all stumbled backward. When they recovered and checked the feed, the camera was pointing up the shaft, showing the distant circle of daylight far above. And between the camera and the surface, descending rapidly, were shapes. Human-shaped, but wrong, moving through the water with coordinated precision. Marshall counted 6 of them, maybe more, all rising toward the surface with purpose that suggested intelligence and intention. "Everyone back to the vehicles," Guidry commanded. "Now!" They ran, leaving Dr. Robichaux's equipment behind. Marshall grabbed her laptop and helped her to her van while the others provided cover, weapons drawn, watching the well for any sign of emergence. They made it to their vehicles as the first shape broke the surface. It climbed out of the well with movements that were jerky and wrong, like someone learning to use limbs for the first time. The body was humanoid, but the proportions were off. Too long in the torso, too thin in the limbs. And the face, when it turned toward them, was a mask of features that almost looked human but missed in ways that made Marshall's training scream danger. More shapes emerged, pulling themselves from the well, standing in the clearing with that same impossible stillness. Marshall counted 9 of them, all facing the convoy, all watching with eyes that reflected the morning light wrong. Then one of them spoke, and Marshall's blood ran cold because the voice was Tommy LaRue's. But the mouth movements didn't match the words. "You shouldn't have opened it. We were keeping it closed, keeping them contained. Now they know you're here." "Tommy!" Marshall called out, his hand on his weapon. "Is that you?" The shape that had spoken tilted its head too far, impossibly far. I was Tommy. Part of me still is. But mostly, I'm what the water makes when it takes people who get too close. We tried to warn you. The transmissions were warnings, not calls for help. Marshall felt reality tilt. You've been sending the transmissions. We repeat what we remember, what we were before the water changed us. We stay here, keep the well sealed, keep what's deeper from coming up. But you've opened it now. They felt it. They're coming. What's coming? What's deeper in that shaft? The Tommy shape's mouth moved wrong, forming words that sounded wet and wrong. The others. The ones who went down before us. Before there were police or deputies or laws. The ones who built this place and then got trapped in it. They've been down there so long they've forgotten what human means. And now they know the way is open. From the well, Marshall heard sound. Not the radio transmissions, but something else. Something that sounded like voices, but in frequencies that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. The 9 shapes in the clearing turned as one, facing the well, their bodies tensing in what might have been fear or preparation. "You need to leave," the Tommy shape said. "Get out of the parish if you can. They're territorial. They don't like anyone knowing they're here. The ones of us who stayed, who became guardians, we keep the secret, but you've broken it now. They won't let you leave knowing what you know." "We're not leaving without answers," Guidry said, his voice steady despite the situation. "We're not leaving without finding out what happened to our people. Your people are here. We're all here. Everyone who disappeared. We guard the well, keep it sealed, try to stop what we became from happening to others. But we're losing. Every year, more of us forget why we're here. Forget what we were protecting. Soon, we'll all be like the ones below, just hunger and instinct, and the need to pull others into the water." Movement from the well. Something was rising, something bigger than the shapes that had already emerged. Marshall could see it through the opening, a mass that filled the shaft, pulling itself up with appendages that might have been arms or might have been something else entirely. "Go!" the Tommy shape screamed, and the sound was all human terror despite the wrong body it came from. "Go now!" The convoy didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled into their vehicles and accelerated away from the clearing, tires spinning in mud, equipment abandoned in their panic to escape. Marshall looked back through the rear window and saw the shapes in the clearing forming a line between the well and the retreating vehicles, as if trying to hold back whatever was emerging. They made it to the paved section of Parish Road 24 before Marshall's radio crackled to life. Tommy's voice, clear and strong, without static this time. "Marshall, if you're hearing this, I need you to do something for me. I need you to make sure the well stays sealed. Use concrete, use whatever you have to, but don't let anyone open it again. Don't let them come up, please." Marshall grabbed his radio. "Tommy, we're coming back for you. We're not leaving you there. I'm already gone. Have been for 12 years. What you saw back there, that's not me anymore. That's just something wearing my shape and my memories. The real Tommy LaRue died the night I went down into that shaft. This is something else. Something that's trying to hold on to what human means, but losing the fight. What do we tell your family? They've been waiting 12 years for answers." A pause, then, "Tell them I died in the line of duty. Tell them I was trying to help someone and it went wrong. Don't tell them what I became. Let them remember me as I was." The transmission cut off, replaced by static, then silence. Marshall sat in Guidry's truck as they drove back toward civilization, his mind trying to process what he'd seen. The shapes that had been people, the thing rising from the well, the confirmation that everyone who'd disappeared from this area was still here in some form, transformed into something that guarded against something worse. They made it back to the sheriff's office by noon. Dr. Robichaux's equipment was lost, left behind in the panic, but she had her laptop with the recordings. They spent the next 6 hours in the conference room, going through everything they'd documented, trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. "This has to be reported," Trooper Gautreau said. We have evidence of something unknown, potentially dangerous, operating in Louisiana. Reported to who? Guidry asked. What department handles this? What jurisdiction covers things that used to be human but aren't anymore? The state police, Gautreau insisted. The attorney general, someone with authority to investigate and contain this. Marshall looked at the recordings on Dr. Robichaud's laptop, at the shapes emerging from the well, at the thing that had Tommy's voice but not his body. Tommy asked us to seal the well, to keep what's below from coming up. If we report this officially, there'll be teams, investigations, attempts to capture and study those things, and whatever they're holding back, whatever's deeper in that shaft, it'll get loose. So, what do you suggest? Guidry asked. We do what Tommy asked. We seal the well with concrete. We mark the site as hazardous, and we keep quiet about what we saw. The 9 shapes, the guardians, whatever they are, they're trying to protect people. We help them do that. Dr. Robichaud shook her head. I can't keep this quiet. This is the most significant acoustic phenomenon I've ever documented. The scientific implications alone, there are 17 people missing from this parish over 30 years, Marshall interrupted. 17 families that never got closure. If we expose this, if we let researchers and military and whoever else swarm that site, those 9 guardians won't be able to hold the line. And whatever comes up from below will make 17 disappearances look like nothing. Dr. Robichaud was quiet for a long moment. Then she closed her laptop. All right, I'll keep the audio recordings but mark them as inconclusive equipment malfunction. But I want a promise from all of you. If this situation changes, if those things stop being guardians and start being threats, we report it immediately. They all agreed, though Marshall wondered how they'd know when that line had been crossed. Marshall didn't sleep for 2 days. He kept seeing those shapes emerging from the well, kept hearing Tommy's voice coming from a body that was no longer human. On Monday morning, he called in sick and drove to a construction supply company in Houma, where he purchased 3 pallets of quick-setting concrete, rebar, and a portable mixer. The clerk looked at him strangely when he paid in cash and refused delivery service, but Marshall didn't offer explanations. Sheriff Guidry called at 15:23 hours. I heard you bought enough concrete to seal a bunker. Want to tell me what you're planning? I'm doing what Tommy asked. I'm sealing that well. Not alone, you're not. Give me 2 hours to arrange things. Guidry arrived at Marshall's apartment with Deputy Sebastian Landry and a flatbed truck. They loaded the concrete and equipment without discussion. 3 men who decided that some truths needed to be buried before they could spread. The state police are asking questions, Guidry said as they drove south. Gautreau and Bergeron filed preliminary reports about equipment failure and environmental hazards. They're being vague, but someone in Baton Rouge is going to want details eventually. What did you tell them? That we're following up on the hazard assessment. That we're taking measures to secure the site until a proper environmental study can be conducted. That bought us maybe a week before someone higher up starts demanding answers. They reached Parish Road 24 as the sun was setting, the light turning everything orange and red. The road looked different in daylight's end, less threatening but somehow more sad, like a place that had given up pretending to be part of the civilized world. The clearing was empty when they arrived. The well stood open, the iron cap still lying where they'd discarded it. Dr. Robichaud's abandoned equipment sat in the mud, expensive sensors and cameras already being reclaimed by the marsh. But the 9 shapes were gone, and the silence that had been so oppressive on Saturday was now just normal evening quiet. Birds called from the trees, insects hummed in the undergrowth, the world pretending nothing unusual had happened here. Marshall approached the well carefully, his flashlight showing the same dark water below, the same circle of floating radios. But something had changed. The radios were dark now, their lights extinguished, and when Marshall dropped a stone into the water, it sank without the resistance he'd expected. Whatever had been powering those devices was gone. "Think they're still down there?" Deputy Landry asked, keeping his hand near his weapon. "I don't know, but we're doing this whether they are or not." They set up the portable mixer and began the work. Mix concrete, pour it down the well, wait for it to set enough to support the next layer. It was slow, methodical work, and as darkness fell, they set up work lights that turned the clearing into a harsh white island in the surrounding night. At 2134 hours, Marshall's radio crackled, not with static this time, but with a voice he recognized. Tommy, clear and strong. "Thank you for doing this, for following through." Marshall grabbed his radio. "Tommy, where are you? Can you come to the surface?" "We're here, all 9 of us, watching from the tree line. We can't come closer. The thing in the shaft, it's awake now. It knows what you're doing, and it's fighting us, trying to get past us to stop you." Marshall looked toward the trees but saw nothing except darkness and the gleam of eyes that might have been animals, or might have been something else. "What is it? What's down there?" A pause long enough that Marshall thought the transmission had ended. Then, "It's what we'll all become eventually. The final stage. When you've been in the water so long that everything human is gone. When all that's left is hunger and the need to spread. It used to be people too, a long time ago. The ones who built this facility, who were doing experiments we found records of but couldn't understand. They went too deep, stayed too long, and changed into something that can't die and can't stop. How many? We don't know. Dozens? Maybe hundreds. They're all connected down there, all part of the same thing, and they've been trying to get out for 60 years. We keep them contained, but we're not strong enough. Every year, we lose one of us to the change. Jacques went last year. Stopped fighting it, went down into the shaft, never came back up. In another few years, we'll all be gone and there'll be nothing stopping them from rising." Marshall looked at the well, at the concrete they were pouring that would seal it for years, but maybe not forever. "Will this be enough? Will concrete stop them?" "For a while. But they're patient. They'll wait, they'll work at it, they'll eventually break through. You're buying time, that's all. Maybe another 20 years, maybe 50. Eventually, someone will have to do this again. Then we'll do it again. We'll keep doing it as long as we have to." Tommy's laugh was bitter. "You think you'll remember? You think in 20 years anyone will believe what you saw here? They'll dismiss it, rationalize it, decide it was mass hallucination or equipment failure or anything except the truth. That's how it works. That's why this place has been taking people for 100 years and nobody stops it." Guidry had moved closer, listening to the transmission. He took Marshall's radio. "Tommy, this is Sheriff Guidry. I remember you as a good officer, a good man. Tell me how to stop this permanently. Tell me how to end it." Another long pause. Then, "You can't. The thing in the shaft, it's part of the water system now. It's connected to every bayou, every canal, every swamp in the parish. Killing it would mean draining half of Louisiana, and even then, you'd just be pushing it somewhere else. It's not an infestation you can remove. It's part of the ecosystem now." "Then what do we do?" "What you're doing. Seal the well, keep people away from this site, and pray that we Guardians can hold the line a little longer. And when you hear the transmissions on the anniversary, when some young trooper comes to you scared because he's hearing voices on his radio, you tell him the truth. You pass on the knowledge so it doesn't die with your generation." Marshall took the radio back. "Tommy, your family, they deserve to know something." "I know, and that's the hardest part of this. Letting them think I abandoned them, that I ran off or got killed by some random violence. But that's better than the truth. better than knowing what I became. I can't do that to them. I won't. Then tell them I died trying to protect people. Tell them I found something dangerous and I stayed behind to contain it. That's true enough. Just don't tell them I'm still here, still conscious, still watching my humanity slip away piece by piece. That would destroy them. The transmission ended, and Marshall stood there with the radio in his hand, understanding the impossible weight that Tommy and the other guardians carried. They were prisoners of their own sacrifice, trapped between human and monster, holding back something worse while slowly becoming it themselves. They worked through the night, pouring concrete until the well was filled to within 5 feet of the surface. Then they set rebar and poured a cap, thick and reinforced, that would take serious equipment to break through. By dawn, the well was sealed, just another concrete pad in a clearing that would eventually be reclaimed by the marsh. As they packed up their equipment, Marshall noticed something carved into one of the wooden posts that ringed the site. Fresh marks, made recently with something sharp. He moved closer and felt his blood run cold. It was a message, carved in unsteady letters, 17 years, J.M., Jacques Melançon, the deputy who'd disappeared in '97. He'd been a guardian for 17 years before finally succumbing to the change and going down into the shaft. Marshall did the math. Tommy had been a guardian for 12 years. That meant he had maybe 5 years left before he followed Melançon into the depths. "You see this?" Marshall called to Guidry. The sheriff came over, read the carving, and his face went gray. Jesus. 17 years of that existence, and then what? You just give up? You let yourself become that thing in the shaft? Or you fight it until you lose anyway, Marshall said quietly. Either way, you end up the same. They drove back to Thibodaux in silence. The sun was rising over the marsh, turning the water gold and making everything look peaceful and normal. But Marshall knew that beneath that peaceful surface, things moved and changed, and waited with patience that human minds couldn't comprehend. At the sheriff's office, they found Dr. Robichaud waiting with her laptop and an expression that was equal parts excited and terrified. "I've been analyzing the audio from Saturday," she said, without preamble. "The transmissions, the voices, the static patterns. And I found something that I think you need to hear." She played a recording, audio that had been filtered and enhanced to remove background noise. At first, Marshall heard only the transmissions they'd already documented. Tommy's voice, Melançon's voice, the wildlife officer from 1989. But underneath those voices, barely audible, was something else. A layer of sound that the equipment had captured, but that human ears couldn't normally process. It was voices, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all speaking at once in a frequency just below normal hearing. And they were all saying the same thing, over and over. "Help us. Remember us. Don't let us be forgotten." Dr. Robichaud's hands were shaking as she paused the playback. That's what the entity is doing. It's not just transforming people, it's absorbing them. Every person who's disappeared into that shaft, they're all still there, all still conscious in some way, all trapped inside something that won't let them die. Marshall felt sick. "So the thing in the shaft, it's made of people. It's made of hundreds of people from over a century of disappearances, and they're all aware, all suffering, all begging to be remembered because that's the only thing they have left that's human." Guidry sat down heavily. "Mother of God, we sealed them in there. We trapped them." "They were already trapped," Marshall said. "We just kept more people from joining them. That's what Tommy wanted. That's what the Guardians are fighting for." Dr. Robichaud closed her laptop. "I'm deleting this recording. I'm deleting everything from Saturday except the basic equipment failure report. Because if anyone hears this, if any researcher or military division gets hold of this evidence, they'll open that shaft. They'll try to study it, try to understand it, and they'll just feed it more victims. "What about your career?" Marshall asked. "This is the discovery of a lifetime. Some discoveries shouldn't be made. Some knowledge shouldn't be shared. I'll survive with my reputation intact and my conscience clear." Over the next week, life in Lafourche Parish returned to something resembling normal. The state police accepted the environmental hazard designation for the Leeville site. The parish council authorized a permanent closure order for Parish Road 24 beyond the Golden Meadow Junction. Barriers were erected, warning signs posted, and the official story became that the area was contaminated with industrial waste from old oil field operations. Marshall returned to his regular patrol schedule, working the graveyard shift on Highway 1, watching for drunk drivers and speeders and all the normal violations that made up a trooper's night. But every time he passed the turnoff to Parish Road 24, he thought about the 9 guardians standing watch over something that wanted to spread, wanted to consume, wanted to add more voices to its chorus of the trapped and transformed. On the 15th night after they'd sealed the well, Marshall's radio crackled at 0147 hours. Tommy's voice clear and calm. "Marshall, I wanted to thank you again. For listening, for following through, for giving us a few more years to hold the line. I know it wasn't easy keeping this secret." Marshall grabbed his radio. "How are you holding up?" "I'm still me, mostly. Still remember what it was like to be human, to have a family, to care about people. But it's getting harder. The hunger is growing stronger. I can feel myself wanting to go down into the shaft, wanting to join with what's below. It's like a pull, getting stronger every day. Fight it, Tommy. Don't let it take you. I'm trying, we all are. But Jacques lasted 17 years and he was stronger than me. I don't know if I have that long." Marshall drove slowly, watching the dark marsh roll past. "What happens if all 9 of you fail? If you all go down into the shaft, then the entity will be strong enough to break through the concrete. It'll rise, spread through the water system, start taking people faster than it has been. Within a decade, maybe 2, half of South Louisiana will be contaminated. People will start changing, start becoming guardians themselves without understanding why. And the cycle will continue, unless someone stops it. There is no stopping it, only containing it, only buying time and hoping that time is enough." Marshall thought about the message carved on the post. 17 years. "Tommy, when you feel yourself getting close to the end, when you think you can't fight it anymore, I want you to contact me. Radio, phone, whatever works. Don't go down alone. Let me know so I can bear witness, so someone remembers that you fought." Tommy's voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you. That means more than you know. To die knowing someone will remember, that someone will know we didn't give up without a fight. I'll remember, and I'll make sure others know too. Not the full truth, but enough. Enough that you're honored for what you're doing." The transmission ended, and Marshall continued his patrol. But now he drove with new purpose, new understanding. He wasn't just enforcing laws and responding to emergencies. He was bearing witness to a sacrifice that would never be publicly acknowledged, to guardians who gave up their humanity to protect people who would never know their names. 2 months later, Marshall was called to Sheriff Guidry's office. Inside, he found Trooper Evangeline Gautreau and a man he didn't recognize. The man was in his 60s, wearing a suit that looked federal, with eyes that had seen too much. "Trooper Thibodeau," the man said. "I'm Agent Victor Chauvin with the Louisiana Bureau of Investigation's Special Circumstances Division. I understand you were part of the investigation at Leeville Station. Marshall felt his guard go up. That investigation was concluded. Environmental hazard, site secured, case closed. Yes, I read the reports. Very thorough, very professional, and completely inadequate at explaining what actually happened. Guidry leaned forward. Agent Chauvin, if you have concerns about our investigation, I have concerns about a pattern, Chauvin interrupted. Leeville Station is the 4th site in Louisiana where we've documented similar phenomena. Radio transmissions from missing persons, underground structures that don't appear on any official maps, and transformation of human subjects into something that exhibits quasi-protective behavior toward uncontaminated populations. Marshall exchanged glances with Guidry. You know about the Guardians. We know about many things that don't make it into public awareness. My division was created 20 years ago specifically to monitor and contain these situations. We've been tracking the Leeville site since the 1990s. Then why didn't you intervene? Marshall asked, anger flaring. Why let officers keep disappearing if you knew what was happening? Chauvin's expression was grim. Because intervention makes it worse. Every time we've tried to extract Guardians, study the entities, or eliminate the contamination, we've only accelerated the spread. The Guardians serve a function. They're the entity's immune system, the thing that keeps it from growing too fast. Remove them, and the entity just creates new ones faster than we can contain them. So you just let them suffer? Let them slowly lose their humanity while you watch? We document, we monitor, and we prepare for the day when containment fails. Chauvin pulled out a folder. I'm here because that day might be approaching. We've lost contact with 2 of our monitoring stations near similar sites. The radio transmissions are getting stronger, appearing more frequently, reaching wider areas. Something is changing, and we need to know if your site is showing the same patterns. Marshall thought about Tommy's voice on the radio, about the call 2 months ago where he'd admitted the hunger was growing stronger. The Guardians are weakening. They won't be able to hold much longer. That's what we're seeing across all 4 sites, which means we need to implement contingency protocols. Permanent site closure, population monitoring, establishment of observation posts to track any spread. What about the people who are already transformed? Gautreau asked. The Guardians? Do we just abandon them? Chauvin's face showed genuine regret. There's no cure, there's no reversal. All we can do is honor their sacrifice by making sure it wasn't for nothing. We keep the sites contained, keep people away, and buy as much time as possible. He handed Marshall a card. If you hear those transmissions again, if anything changes at the Leeville site, you contact me immediately. Don't try to investigate alone. Don't try to help the Guardians. Just report it and let us handle the response. After Chauvin left, Marshall sat with Guidry and Gautreau in the conference room, 3 law enforcement officers who'd been drafted into a war they didn't understand against an enemy that couldn't be defeated. Special Circumstances Division, Gautreau said quietly. I've been state police for 11 years, and I never knew that existed. That's the point, Guidry said. They operate in the spaces between jurisdictions, handling things that don't fit into normal categories. I've heard rumors about them, but I never thought I'd be sitting in a room with one of their agents. Marshall looked at Chauvin's card. He said there are 4 sites, which means there are 4 groups of Guardians out there, all fighting the same fight Tommy and his people are fighting. How many people have been transformed? How many are trapped in those entities? Don't think about it, Guidry advised. You start trying to count the cost, you'll go crazy. Just focus on what we can do. Keep the site secure, keep people away, and hope the Guardians can hold long enough for someone to figure out a permanent solution. But Marshall knew there was no permanent solution. There was only time. Bought at the cost of human lives, transformed into something that protected people while slowly losing everything that made those lives worth protecting. The Guardians stood watch in the darkness, holding back the tide, sacrificing themselves so that others could live normal lives without ever knowing how close the darkness actually was. And somewhere in the marsh near Leeville Station, Tommy LaRue stood with 8 others, watching the sealed well, fighting the hunger that grew stronger every day, holding the line between human and monster for just a little bit longer. 4 years and 7 months after they sealed the well, Marshall got the call he'd been dreading. It was 03:12 hours on a Tuesday in May, and his radio crackled to life with a voice that sounded like Tommy, but wasn't quite anymore. The words were slurred, the cadence wrong, like someone speaking through water or from very far away. "Marshall, it's time. I can't hold on anymore. The hunger's too strong. I'm going down." Marshall was on Highway 1 near Raceland, and he immediately turned around heading toward the Parish Road 24. "Tommy, stay with me. Don't go down. I'm coming to you." "Don't. You can't help. Nobody can. I needed someone to know. Someone to remember that I tried." Marshall pushed his Crown Victoria to 80 on the narrow highway, his lights cutting through fog that had rolled in from the marsh. "How many of you are left?" 6 now. We lost Celestin last month. He went down without saying goodbye, just walked into the water one night and never came back up. Baptiste went 2 years ago. Jacques, you already know about. It's just 6 of us now, and we're all feeling it. The pull, the need to join with what's below. Fight it, Tommy. You've fought for 12 years. You can fight longer. A sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. 12 years, 4 months, and 16 days. I've counted every one. Counted every sunrise I've watched from the tree line. Every night standing guard over that sealed well. Every moment of watching my body change and my thoughts become less human. I'm so tired, Marshall. So tired of fighting. Marshall reached the turnoff to Parish Road 24, blowing past the barriers and warning signs. The road was worse than he remembered, washed out in places, reclaimed by vegetation. His patrol car bottomed out twice before he reached the clearing. The sealed well was still intact, the concrete cap showing no signs of disturbance. But around it stood 6 figures, tall and thin, with bodies that were no longer quite human. Marshall could see them in his headlights, could see how much they'd changed since that day 4 years ago. They were less human now, more like the thing in the shaft, but still distinct enough that Marshall could pick out which one was Tommy by the way he stood, by the slight tilt of his head that had been a habit when he was alive. Marshall got out of his car slowly, his hands visible, making no threatening moves. The 6 figures watched him with eyes that reflected green in his headlights, and Marshall could feel their regard like pressure against his skin. "Tommy, I'm here. Talk to me." The figure that was Tommy stepped forward, moving with that jerky grace that suggested joints didn't quite work the way they should. When he spoke, his mouth didn't move right, the words coming from somewhere inside that wasn't quite a throat anymore. "You shouldn't have come. It's dangerous here now. The entity knows the Guardians are weakening. It's testing the seal, trying to break through. We've been holding it back, but we're not strong enough anymore." Marshall moved closer, and now he could see details that made his stomach turn. Tommy's skin had that same waxy quality he'd seen on the things in the Atchafalaya Basin, translucent in places, showing something moving underneath that might have been organs or might have been something else entirely. His hands had too many joints, fingers that were too long, and when he breathed, the sound was wet and wrong. What happens if you go down? What happens to the other 5? They'll hold as long as they can. Maybe another year, maybe 5. Eventually, they'll all follow me down, or They'll become so changed they won't remember why they're guarding this place. And then the entity will break through, and everything we've sacrificed will be for nothing. Then don't go. Stay with them. Keep fighting. Tommy's head tilted too far, bones creaking audibly. You don't understand what it's like. Every day I remember less about being human. Every day the hunger grows stronger, the need to join with what's below. I can feel it calling to me, Marshall, promising an end to the struggle, an end to the pain of trying to hold on to something that's already gone. It would be so easy to just let go. But you haven't, not yet. That means part of you is still fighting, still choosing to be human. Human. The word came out like a curse. I stopped being human the night I went down into that shaft. What I am now is just an echo, a recording playing back memories of what human was supposed to feel like. And that recording is degrading. Soon there won't be anything left but static. From the sealed well came a sound, deep and resonant, felt more than heard. The concrete cap shifted slightly, cracking appearing at the edges. The 5 other guardians immediately moved to the well, placing their hands on the concrete, and Marshall watched as something flowed from them into the cap. Energy, maybe, or just will, but whatever it was, it stabilized the concrete, sealed the cracks. That's what we do now, Tommy said. Every day, every night, pouring what's left of ourselves into keeping the seal intact. And every time we do it, we lose a little more. Soon, we'll have nothing left to give. Marshall felt helpless, watching something that had been his friend sacrifice itself piece by piece to protect people who would never know. There has to be another way, more concrete, deeper seals, something. There is no other way. The entity is part of the water system now. It's in every bayou, every canal, every marsh in the parish. Sealing this well just keeps it from having direct access to the surface, but it's still out there, still spreading slowly, still taking people who get too close to contaminated water. All we're doing is slowing it down. Then why keep fighting? If you can't stop it, why sacrifice yourself? Tommy was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something that might have been a smile. Because slow is enough. Because every year we hold the line is another year that kids grow up, that families stay together, that people live normal lives. We can't save everyone, but we can save today, and tomorrow, and maybe the day after that, until we can't anymore. Marshall felt something break inside him, the weight of what Tommy was saying, the impossible courage of continuing to fight a battle you knew you couldn't win. I'll remember. I'll make sure people know what you did. Don't. That's the point. We fight in silence so others can live in ignorance. If people knew what was really out here, knew what was in the water, they'd panic. They'd leave, and then the entity would spread to wherever they went. Better to keep the secret, keep the boundary contained, even if that means we're forgotten. From the tree line came movement. Marshall turned to see more figures emerging from the shadows. Not guardians, but something else. Shapes that were less formed, more fluid, like bodies that hadn't quite decided what configuration to take. They moved toward the well with purpose, and the 6 guardians immediately formed a line between them and the sealed concrete. New ones, Tommy said. People who got too close to contaminated water in the past few months. They're changing, being drawn here without understanding why. We try to stop them, try to turn them away before they're fully transformed, but some of them get through. Marshall counted 8 approaching figures. What happens to them? If they reach the well before the transformation is complete, they go down. They add their mass to the entity, make it stronger. If we can hold them off until they're fully changed, sometimes they join us, become guardians themselves. But that's rare. Most of them fight us, fight the change, and end up going down anyway. The 8 figures reached the Guardian line, and what happened next made Marshall understand the full scope of what Tommy and the others had been enduring. The approaching figures attacked, not with weapons or coordination, but with desperate thrashing violence. The Guardians held the line, pushing them back, and Marshall could hear sounds of combat that weren't quite physical. It was as if they were fighting on multiple levels at once, physical bodies grappling while something else contested in frequencies Marshall couldn't perceive. One of the approaching figures broke through the line, scrambling toward the well. Tommy moved with impossible speed, tackling it before it could reach the concrete. They rolled in the mud, and Marshall watched in horror as Tommy's body seemed to flow, to reshape itself to better contain his opponent. When he stood up, he was less human than he'd been moments before, and the figure he'd stopped was motionless on the ground. "Did you kill it?" "It's not alive in any way you'd understand. I just dispersed it. Broke the cohesion that was forming. It'll reform eventually. Try again. They always do." The other 7 figures had been driven back by the Guardian line, retreating into the marsh but not leaving entirely. Marshall could see them in the darkness beyond his headlights, waiting, patient, ready to try again. "This is what you've been doing every night for 12 years. Every night, every day, constant vigil, constant battle. We don't sleep, don't rest, don't get breaks. We just stand and hold and try to remember why it matters." Marshall looked at Tommy, at what he'd become, at what he was still choosing to be despite everything. "It matters because you're choosing to make it matter. That's what makes you human, Tommy. Not your body, not your thoughts, but your choice. You're choosing to protect people. That's the most human thing there is." Tommy's laugh was bitter and wet. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just too stubborn to let go. Too proud to admit I've already lost." The concrete cap cracked again, a deep, splitting sound that echoed across the clearing. The 5 Guardians at the well intensified whatever they were doing, and Marshall felt the hair on his arms stand up as if electricity was flowing through the air. The crack sealed, but he could see the strain it took, could see how much it cost them. "They're not going to last," Marshall said. "The seal is failing. I know. That's why I'm going down. Not because I've given up, but because maybe if I add my strength to theirs from inside, I can reinforce the seal from below, hold it together a little longer." Marshall understood then what Tommy was really saying. He wasn't succumbing to the hunger. He was choosing to sacrifice himself completely, to become part of the seal, to use whatever was left of his humanity as mortar to hold back the entity just a little bit longer. How long will it buy? I don't know. A year, 5 years, maybe just months. But that's months more than we'd have otherwise. Marshall pulled out his phone and took a photograph of Tommy, documenting what he'd become, what he'd endured. Tommy didn't object, just stood there in the harsh light of the flash, a monument to sacrifice that would never be publicly acknowledged. "I'm going to tell your story," Marshall said. "Not officially, not in ways that would expose what's happening here, but quietly to people who need to understand that there are officers out there fighting battles nobody sees. Tell them we chose this. That's important. Tell them we saw what needed to be done and we did it, knowing the cost. Because if they think we were just victims, if they think this was something that happened to us rather than something we chose, then the sacrifice means nothing." Marshall nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Tommy turned toward the well, then paused. "There's one more thing you need to know. Agent Chauvin, the LBI agent who briefed you 4 years ago, he's been infected too, exposed to contaminated water at one of the other sites. He's got maybe a year before he starts changing, and when he does, his division will have to decide whether to let him become a guardian or to terminate him before the transformation completes." Jesus, does he know? He knows. He's been documenting everything, preparing his replacement, making sure the knowledge doesn't die with him. Because that's what we do. We pass it on, keep the watch, make sure someone is always standing between the darkness and the people who don't know how close it really is. Tommy walked to the well, placing his hands on the concrete. The other 5 guardians moved aside, creating space for him. He looked back at Marshall one last time, and in the green reflection of his eyes, Marshall saw something that was still recognizably the young trooper who'd disappeared 12 years ago. Still brave, still dedicated, still choosing to serve even when the cost was everything. Tell my family I died protecting people. That's true enough. Everything else is just details. He sank into the concrete as if it were water, his body seeming to dissolve and flow into the seal itself. Marshall watched, unable to look away, as Tommy LaRue made his final sacrifice, becoming part of the barrier between the entity and the world above. When it was done, the concrete looked solid again, reinforced from within. The 5 remaining guardians stood around it, and Marshall could see they were stronger now, steadier, as if Tommy's sacrifice had bought them more time to hold the line. Marshall drove back to Highway 1 as dawn was breaking, his mind full of images he knew would never leave him. He filed no official report, made no record in any database. Instead, he went home and wrote down everything in a journal that he would keep hidden, a document for whoever came after him, whoever inherited the responsibility of bearing witness to sacrifices that couldn't be acknowledged. Over the next 3 years, Marshall continued his patrol, working the graveyard shift on Highway 1, listening to his radio for transmissions that came less frequently now. Sometimes he'd hear voices in the static, not calls for help, but something else, reassurances maybe, or just confirmations that the guardians were still there, still holding, still choosing to stand between the darkness and the light. He attended Tommy LaRue's memorial service, held 13 years after his disappearance when the family finally accepted he was never coming home. Marshall stood in the back of the church and listened to people talk about a young officer who'd died in the line of duty, who'd sacrificed himself protecting others. They had no idea how right they were, and Marshall kept his silence because that's what Tommy had asked of him. Sheriff Guidry retired 2 years after Tommy went down. His replacement was a younger man who knew nothing about Leeville Station, who accepted the environmental hazard designation without question. Marshall tried to brief him once, tried to explain what was really out there, but saw the disbelief in his eyes and stopped. Some truths could only be understood by those who'd witnessed them firsthand. Dr. Robichaux called occasionally, always from different numbers, always brief. She was still monitoring, still documenting, still maintaining the fiction of equipment failure while secretly tracking the phenomenon. She told Marshall that the other 3 sites in Louisiana were experiencing similar patterns. Guardians weakening, seals requiring more frequent reinforcement, the entities beneath growing stronger despite all efforts at containment. "We're losing," she said during one call. "Slowly, but inevitably. Eventually, there won't be enough guardians to hold all 4 sites, and when one breaks through, they'll all follow. We might have 20 years if we're lucky, maybe only 10. And then what? And then South Louisiana becomes uninhabitable. The water will be too contaminated, the transformation too widespread. People will have to evacuate, and the entity will spread to wherever they go. We'll lose the entire Gulf Coast within a generation. There's no way to stop it? If there is, we haven't found it. All we can do is document, prepare, and hope that someone smarter than us figures out an answer before time runs out." 7 years after Tommy went down, on the anniversary of his disappearance, Marshall was on patrol when his radio crackled at 0147 hours. He expected static, expected maybe a faint echo of Tommy's last transmission, what he got was different. Unit 23, this is Guardian Station Leeville. This is not a distress call. This is a status report. The voice was synthesized, mechanical, like multiple voices speaking in unison. Not Tommy anymore, not any individual guardian, but something else. Something that had evolved from what they'd been. Guardian Station, this is Unit 23. I copy your transmission. We are 4 now. 2 went down last year to reinforce the seal. It holds, but the strain increases. The entity below grows stronger, more coordinated. It learns. We estimate containment can be maintained for approximately 9 more years before critical failure. Is there anything I can do? Any way to help? Continue bearing witness. Continue documenting. Continue preparing those who come after you. When containment fails, someone will need to know what happened here, why it happened, and how long we held. That knowledge is our legacy. Do not let it be forgotten. I won't forget. I'll make sure others know. One more thing, Unit 23. Tell them we were not victims. Tell them we were guardians. Tell them we chose this because it was right, because it was necessary, because someone had to stand watch. Tell them we held the line until we couldn't hold it anymore, and even then we held a little longer. The transmission ended, and Marshall sat in his patrol car watching the sunrise over the marsh, thinking about Tommy and the others, about sacrifice that went unrecognized, about choices made in darkness so that others could live in light. He thought about the 9 years they'd estimated before containment failed. 9 years to prepare, to plan, to figure out what would happen when the entity finally broke through, and South Louisiana had to face something that had been held back for over a century by people who gave up their humanity to protect others. 9 years wasn't long enough, but it was what they had. And somewhere in the marsh near Leeville Station, 4 shapes that had once been human stood watch over a sealed well, choosing every moment to continue being guardians, to continue holding the line, to continue making the sacrifice that Tommy LaRue had begun 19 years ago on a night when he'd encountered something in the darkness and decided to stand against it rather than run. The water would eventually win. The entity would eventually break through, but not today, not tomorrow, not while guardians stood watch and officers like Marshall bore witness and remembered that some battles were worth fighting even when you knew you couldn't win. Marshall finished his shift as the sun climbed higher, turning the marsh gold and peaceful, hiding the darkness beneath its surface. He went home to his apartment, opened his hidden journal, and wrote down the transmission he'd received. Added it to the chronicle of sacrifice that he would pass on to whoever came next, whoever inherited the responsibility of remembering that the line had been held, the cost had been paid, and the watch had been kept. Because that's what the guardians had asked for. Not glory, not recognition, not even gratitude. Just to be remembered. To have someone know that they'd stood in the darkness and held back the tide for as long as they possibly could. And Marshall would remember. Until his own service ended, until he passed the knowledge to others, until the day came when remembering wasn't enough and action was required. The static between stations hummed with voices that might have been radio interference, or might have been guardians calling across frequencies that human equipment could barely detect. Marshall listened to it sometimes, late at night when his shift was quiet and he imagined he could hear Tommy's voice among the others. Still transmitting, still warning, still choosing to protect even in the final dissolution of everything that had made him human. The guardians stood watch. The line held. And somewhere in the deep places where water ran black and ancient, something patient and hungry waited for the day when there would be no one left to hold it back.